We will start the second section, and first paper will read Akvilė Rėklaitytė. So please, from Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore. Please, Akvilė.
Hello, everybody. I'm Akvilė Rėklaitytė, research fellow, postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore, where I am doing my research on transformations of Lithuanian poetics at the time of social and political changes, especially at the end of 80s, during extremely intense years of the history of Lithuania. In my research, I focus on the poetic discourse at those last decades. And today I'm going to talk about the emancipation of Lithuanian poetic discourse. As we all know, the process of liberation was full of ideological contradictions, aesthetical transgressions, and experiments followed by regime sanctions. I'm interested in how all these tensions reflect in Lithuanian poetry. In my presentation, I will briefly introduce the material and theoretical and methodological groundings of the research. I will also share some hesitations that I have. I will expose the case of what could be considered as shift in the poetics. And finally, I will suggest some partial conclusions. To move on materials and the problem of the research. The reform movement of Lithuania, Sąjūdis, was very closely related to poetry in Lithuania. I think that this is the case in Latvia as well. Marcelijus Martinaitis once said, and other writers, the witnesses of that time, elaborated the similar idea, that when Sąjūdis commenced, nobody had any decent political vision, any clue on how the country should be run. However, what did consolidate the community and drove the movement for independence, for the most part, was poetry. And indeed, when you look up to the archives, you see crowds singing poems. There are documents from multi-thousand rallies, where poets recited their verses and crowds listened to them ecstatically. There are also documents from the first visit of emigre poet Bernardas Brežņevas in 1989, after 50 years of emigration. Pictures and video recordings assure what witnesses recall. The poet Bernardas Brežņevas gained the role of no less than a religious leader at that time. Brežņevas was welcomed in Lithuania as the Pope. The collection of his poetry was published in a sensational number of copies. The circulation of his book was 10 to 15 times bigger than that of any ordinary poet. These facts from the history of Lithuanian literature are widely known, but still there are not many specified studies on it, especially in the field of poetry and poetics. Therefore, I would like to focus more thoroughly on the genesis and very inception of this poetic earthquake that achieved its peak at the end of 80s, and all of a sudden, right after the independence was restored, the ecstasy of poetry simply evaporated and disappeared. Poets of that time testified that after the independence was regained, something changed, and they experienced the crisis of their creativity. Most of the poets even transferred to the different genre, to essay writing. Of course, the poetics of the time of transformation is very much intertwined with the socio-political reality. We can easily feel or even remember why people at the end of the 80s cried reciting poems and why they carried Bernardas Brežņevas on their hands. Nevertheless, I am curious about what poetry has to do with that. What was happening in the field of poetic imagery and imagination, and in general in the poetic discourse. Poetic discourse is probably the main keyword of my research and the problem as well. How should one research it? And here I am exposing my hesitations. To my mind, there are several ways to do that. For example, we can focus on one certain writer and produce monographs. The insights and conclusions of such profound and thorough research undoubtedly contribute to more general study of culture. In Lithuania, we have monographs and dissertations dedicated to different prominent writers of Soviet times. Eduardas Mieželaitis, Janina Degutytė, Tomas Venclova, Justinas Marcinkevičius, Sigitas Geda, Marcelijus Martinaitis, Judita Vaičiūnaitė, Jonas Juškaitis, Alfonsas Maldonis, and they have become objects and heroes of this kind of profound studies. There are also other ways to research the case, the ways that are more related to the social realm and institutions. Whereas I aim at researching the whole poetic context, the entire flow of the poetic discourse. This risky possibility came to my mind when I worked on some research at the archives of the periodicals. I read different issues of various magazines and newspapers as if I lived at that time, bearing in mind that literature and art as one of the means of propaganda was under the control of the regime and was to present the official ideological perspective. I wondered how come that this strictly controlled poetic discourse gradually expanded its boundaries up to such an extent where almost anything was possible to be said. I mean, discourse doesn't always develop solely according to official directives and regulations. In artistic creation, there is always an independent element that is beyond official instructions. So I wonder how this independent imagination spread, disseminated, and permeated both artistic and social realms. I completely understand that it is impossible to study everything, all poetry at once, so I decided to focus on certain spheres that I think can represent the whole. Namely, it is an annual poetry almanac, Poezijos Pavasaris, Poetry Spring, which was established along with a poetry festival under the same title, Poetry Spring, in 1965 to commemorate the 20 years after the prominent poet Salomėja Nėris passed away. The main initiator and organizer of the event was poet Justinas Marcinkevičius, a very significant figure of Lithuanian literature of Soviet era, although nowadays he is considered quite controversially. The established almanac was meant to present the current stage of the poet every year. About 5 to 7 poets were included in the editorial board with a chief editor, and another poet from the board was assigned to be the main composer or editor of the volume. It has to be said that the almanac Poezijos Pavasaris was a way democratic channel. It was edited mainly by young and talented people, not mainly, but young and talented people were involved in the board, who sought to expand the boundaries of the artistic space by publishing those poets who were rejected and not published elsewhere. As one member of the editorial board of earlier 70s, Kęstutis Nastopka, testifies, such a position of the almanac was also sanctioned. For example, in 1973, when the chief editor of that year, the poet Marcelijus Martinaitis, was selecting poems for the volume, another supervisor, namely Kazys Ambrasas, the chief editor of the publishing house Vaga, was assigned to revise the manuscript of the almanac, and after his corrections, he removed majority of poems. Marcelijus Martinaitis and other member of the board, Kęstutis Nastopka, they just left the editorial board, and it was their protest, which can be seen in the context of other protests of that time, such like self-immolation acts by Jan Palach in Czechoslovakia in 1969, Eliyahu Rips in Latvia, and we had the case of Romas Kalanta in 1972. Sanctions also affected the aesthetic realm and the publishing. This socio-political and socio-cultural matrix is a never-ending digging at the archives. But today here, I will focus only on poetry, on in Poezijos Pavasaris Almanac. And I have to admit that I was also planning to talk about another channel, another literary magazine, Pergalė, Victory, that was established in 1945 by Soviet authority and is being published up until now, but I'm afraid I won't have time to elaborate more on this magazine, although I have made a primary research on it too. Firstly, several notes on theory and methodology. There are several theoretical assumptions that I rely on, and the first one is by Michel Foucault. Let me quickly remind that Foucault defines discourse as the general domain of all statements. This means that discourse can be used to refer to all utterances and statements which have been made, which have meaning, and which have some effect. This involves both written utterances and unwritten rules and structures which produce and initiate particular utterances and statements. In a similar way, I tend to perceive the entirety of poems published during the Soviet period. In other words, what was published, it functioned as a meaning and thus affected the rest of the discourse. Another assumption refers to the idea of cultural anthropologists and new historicists. Anyway, they both are interrelated, that literature and art not only capture the unconscious shifts in mentality, but also actively design them by providing certain imagery and thus activating a certain type of emotional culture. I also rely on Vytautas Kavolis' idea that as the symbolic imagery changes, it displays the ongoing transformations in mentality. According to Kavolis, artistic discourse, especially poetry, is the first to capture transformations of the community's mentality and self-perception, whereas sociological research can only access and study evident consequences, but hardly grasps the very genesis of the transformation. So returning to my topic, while reading poetry publications in the mentioned almanac, Poezijos Pavasaris, I try to observe those publications all together as an entirety, and I am at registering aesthetic shifts in the discourse. Now I will briefly present some interesting moments in the poetics that I noticed reading Almanac volume, written utterances, as Foucault put it, and at the same time bearing in mind those unwritten utterances, all ideological regulations, restrictions, and directives that really participated in the discourse. As I made sure of it working at the archives and reading those protocols and discussions of Writers' Union. Let's look at the poem by Algimantas Baltakis of the year 1964. You can use another display to see the quotation better. There is a philological translation, just philological, not poetical, although it's odd to discuss this translation, especially that is written according to the socialist realistic manner, where the rhyme is significant. I will read just a short excerpt in Lithuanian and in English. Rudens ekvinokcija. Dabar naktis prilygsta dienai, pačioj pusiaukelėj esu. Aš kairę ranką mėnesienai, o saulei dešinę tiesiu. Šviesą suprantu ir tamsą, šviesos perpus, tamsos perpus. Akimirka, kai nei rytams, nei vakarams skriaudos nebus. And the ending, ir tik žmogaus širdis negali simetrijai paklusti šiai, kairiai palieka lygi galo, be kompromisų išdidžiai. And I don't know how can you see the display, but it speaks about the symmetry of day and night, of light and darkness. Now night equals a day, and I am halfway there. I stretch out my left hand to the sun, and I stretch the right one to the moon. A short night equals a day. The grief is tantamount to joy. As if arteries and veins, there is symmetry, access everywhere, and the only human hurt cannot obey this symmetry. The hurt remains at the right until the end, with no compromises in dignity and in pride, something like that. So what tells this poem is the utterance, or in other words, the product of the certain historical period. Here we see that the lyrical subject, the speaker, perceives the world as a very clearly structured and well-arranged space. Everything looks symmetric and properly arranged. There is right, there is left, there is the sun, there is the moon, there is darkness, there is light, there is day and there is night, grief and joy. Lyrical subject himself, a human being, a man, according to the Soviet ethos, I hardly imagine that this could be a woman, is a monumental, titanic, gigantic being. He stretches out his hand up to the moon. He can reach the sun by hand. Technically, this image of him very much reminds of another famous poetic image, a man, from Eduardas Mieželaitis' legendary poem that became a symbol of the socialist realist canon. In Baltakis' poem, the only element which does not strictly follow the symmetric order is human hurt. Today, in the morning session, we heard Stella Pelš's presentation on the open system of socialist realism, getting towards stylistic diversity. So this detail of the image of a fragile heart is a sign of this stylistic diversity, moving towards more human socialist realistic manner. Interestingly, in the poem, hurt is located in the left side, what also brings the meaning of political left. Anyways, this poetic image of human hurt that is not obedient to external order signifies a new conception of human. And now let's look to the late 70s and to the dominant poetic imagery of that time. Besides other vivid themes in poetry of that time, such as new interpretations of national history, also religious symbols and themes, modernist surrealistic imagery, we see that lyrical subject in poems, lyrical speaker, is in a very different mood now. And here is a piece from the poem by Jonas Strielkūnas. Also, I give a philological translation of the poem. Now the lyrical speaker is not this optimistic and harmonious as he was in Baltakis' poem about 13 years ago. Now he is dealing with hesitations. He asks, do you believe that those towers and walls will stand forever? He also raises other existential questions. Why does he do this? To my mind, because he realizes ruins in his existence. He says ruins, ruins all around, despite the fact that he still pays efforts to hold the walls of the collapsing time and world. Bet eina žmogus į griūvantį laiką ir griūvančias sienas lyg milžinas laiko, nors aplinkui vien tik griuvėsiai. But man goes into collapsing time and like a giant holds this collapsing walls. So what changed? How come lyrical speaker realized ruins in his soul rather than a sweet little heart beating at the left side? The answer, to my mind, is complex. One of the main factors is that the space of artistic and poetic imagination had expanded gradually. And Almanac Poezijos Pavasaris had much to do with that, because those young and disobedient poet members of editorial board did their best publishing forbidden poetry in the almanac. At the same time, at the poets section of the Writers' Union, including those same editors of the almanac, they participated in vivid discussions on contemporary poetry and on its character and the mission and idea. Gradually, our existentialist poet, Vytautas Mačernis, also existentialist emigre poets, Alfonsas Nyka Niliūnas, Henrikas Radauskas, Algimantas Mackus, and also translations of world's famous modernists were officially introduced to Lithuanian audience in the pages of Almanac. This is how they got into circulation among readers. Besides, poetry of young generation poets was also very welcomed in the almanac like nowhere else. The cultural interests and the modernistic and postmodernistic poetic imagery undoubtedly affected the entire poetic discourse. We also shouldn't forget artists, painters, and graphic artists who were great modernists, good friends of poets, and contributed to the almanac and to poetry books. Eventually transformed poetry, to compare to the primary idea of the socialist realism, flooded the poetic discourse. Existentialistic moods and surrealistic imagery in poetry became a new normal. So today I wanted to pay attention to this shift. That poetry, poetic constructions expanded boundaries of the imagination. And my idea is that once the poetic image is embodied, once it is uttered suggestively in a poem or in any piece of art, this image becomes a kind of independent, like a total asset or common property. And it spreads further on vividly. In this process, less talented poets also plays no less important role, because they reproduce and repeat those suggestive poetic figures, thus contributing to embedding specific meanings. As Marcelius Martinaitis once said, poetry greatly electrifies the imagination, and it is difficult to keep vibrant things engaged and reserved too much, even though it is not clear where it all leads. So the final partial conclusion today of my presentation would be this, that poetry during Brežņev's era was another way to escape and exceed the social reality, besides drinking, which was presented in detail in Dovlatov's novels, as we learned in the past session. Thank you.
Thank you, Akvilė. And we started 5 minutes later, maybe 2 short questions you have. So if no questions at this time, so thank Akvilė. And the next paper will read Donata Mitaitė from Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore. So please, Donata.
So the title of my paper is, oh, it opened. So I will just read. Last night I tried to make my paper shorter, and I just hope that it is shorter now, but that it will be understandable. Similarly to other unfree countries, people, especially artists, have been comparing the life in the Soviet Union to living in a cramped prison with a lack of air. This is especially visible the only publisher of fiction in Lithuania at that time, later the chairman of the Writers' Union. Of course, he was also a member of the Communist Party and so on. Vaičiūnaitė lived from literary work. She did not perform any state service, neither was she a communist. The youngest of the three, Antanas Ioninas, was an editor in a publishing house and in his youth lived a bohemian life along a number of his friends. Maldonis' first books had many Soviet topics, war, collectivization, Soviet atheism, etc., and a vocabulary close to official phraseology. However, archives contain a copy of an unpublished poem from 1960 that starts with a rhetorical question, quotation, "Little poets of a little nation, what do you still believe after choosing this path? Without feeling space, will you feel that you are made for the greater flight?" Of course, Maldonis' position brought him privileges. Several times he was allowed to leave the borders of the Soviet Union, but we know that such journeys were not of a free man, but were well supervised by the KGB. In 1968, when the Prague Spring was suppressed, Maldonis wrote several poems that were only published in 1996. For an analysis of space, the most important of them is the poem Chivchev. The date of writing is not its only relation to the events of Prague. There are also some allusions, quotation. In these ends there live hopes, hearts, voices, and relentless heads. The other quotation. Day after day, every time more eyes turn towards the sun. The title of the poem refers to a common chivchev, a small bird of indistinct colors that builds enclosed nests. The whole text of this long poem emphasizes the parallel between the natural and human worlds. The poet wishes that people who turn towards the sun and over whom hangs a great danger were able cover and hide, just like the chivchev. The poem ends with a contradiction between suggesting to live in secret and worrying that no one will notice the death of those in hiding. But still, in this case, the poet considers closeness to be positive, while there is no way to resist the state or the occupant army. If we consider the Prague Spring, it helps to survive and gather strength. Such view is today very often considered as conformist. In 1980, and Maldonis' poem Glass Coffin has double date, 1980 and 1992, and sums up the experience of a lifetime. The quotation, "Oh, surely all colors were glimmering while the sun of our lives shone, rose, curled on the ground. But the spirit stiffened there, and glass coffin was the sky, and all our life in it." Here we may remember Maldonis' official duties, illusions he had for some time during Khrushchev's thaw and until the suppression of the Prague Spring. So the illusions that the Soviet system could be improved. For this, you got a life in a cramped glass coffin. Similarly to the poem Chivchev, there is a different dramatic side of closeness. You had to seek for everything that is real yourself, walking as blind roots in the dark. In addition to well-known literary images of Sister Death, St. Francis of Assisi, Sister Life, Boris Pasternak, and also Sister Life or Sister Quotidienne, Jonas Aistis, a classic of Lithuanian literature that lived in emigration, and also wrote a poem Glass Coffin, but I will not go into intertextual relations this time. Maldonis added one essential to him, sister space, without which he was forced to live. Antanas Joaninas is the youngest of the poets I have read on the chosen aspect. As far as I know already from youth, he had no illusions about the political system in which he lived. The world of Joanina's Soviet-era poetry is closed. Locomotive trains stand still. Even streams run nowhere. There are many dead ends. One poem also talks about letters sent to oneself. Human contracts are constrained. In his Soviet poetry, Joaninas repeats the image of a cage several times. In the poem Bad in a Cage, the bad act is actually mentioned only in the title. The speaker is someone who sees the world through the bars of a cage. Essentially, a different world may not even exist. Quotation, what do my walls see? They see each other, and I have no other space, no watch shows my time, no mirror shows my face, end of quotation. Melancholically elegiac melody of Joanina's poem somewhat hides the tragic meaning of its words. Quotation, I knew that not wanting anything else is a beautiful dream of the closed. And spontaneously I saw a parallel, a poem Nightingale by Yelena Schwartz, a few years older Russian poet whose poems were not published during Soviet time. The poet chose a bed, a symbol of poetry that persistently tries to break the ball of night's darkness with its voice and get to another space where breathing is without pain, where freedom is. Undoubtedly, the resignation of Joanina's poem and the persistent action of Schwartz, Nightingale, are due related to the personalities and traits of the poet's talents, and a little perhaps to the fact that one officially published the poems and the other did not. I have now destroyed this report's order dictated by biographies. Following her birth date, Vaičiūnaitė should be between Maldonis and Joaninas. However, doing so felt purposeful. I think that at least one poem should be read in more detail, and that will be the poem by Vaičiūnaitė. Here you see it, if you see it. In 1977, Vaičiūnaitė wrote a poem, Goodbye or Farewell. After deeper consideration, the fact that it was published in 1984 surprises and shows that Soviet censors were bad readers. The whole poem reads, can you hear old believers nun praying in the white madhouse ward? Rose, your rose, a red rose, is still blooming in my memory. All Souls' Day has long passed, but there is no snow. Can you hear old believers nun praying? You who moves beyond time, as the railway gleams at night, as the planes roar over graves, a sown northern field. Can you still hear the dreary homeland speech? Can you still see children swaying in the cold autumn silence on muddy Antakalnis hills? Antakalnis is one of districts in Vilnius, Antokol call Russians or Poles. It becomes easier to understand the poem if we remember that in January 1977, Thomas Venslova left the Soviet Union. Both poems were childhood childhood friends. Both have called Vilnius the only city in their poems. Of course, this is only one of the possible contexts of the poem, but anyway, the poem can be read as a story about how a person that has sent others off to emigration sees the Suet Vilnius. The prayer of the old believer's nun in the madhouse from the beginning of the poem is meaningful introduction to the poem's world. Besides the old believers, Staraveri, they had managed to live during ages of persecutions, and they are very persistent, and they still have are still faithful to their faith and their way of life. During Soviet times, monasteries were dispersed, and you know about their fate. Among other punishments for disobedient citizens, the Soviet authorities actively used so-called criminal psychiatry. Many people that were inconvenient for the state were called insane, forcibly put into psychiatric hospitals, and mutilated for life with unnecessary doses of dangerous drugs. Only 2 verses give the poem some light. The only colorful stain in the gray fabric of the poem. Quotation, rose, your rose, red rose is still blooming in my memory. Through its relation with the topic of romance, red rose can be a reference to a love story or at least to a happy moment of the past. Everything else is depressing. Madhouse ward, autumn north, cold, mud. The whiteness of the snow would bring at least some of that lacking light into the landscape and into the human soul. But it seems that even nature has changed, became unjust. All Souls' Day has long passed, but there is no snow. The color white is only in the madhouse ward. Only children could give some light and hope, but that is also not the case. The topic of children seems to frame the poem, which started with the old believer's nun choice of no children, and ends with the hopeless image of children swaying to the cold autumn silence of muddy Antakalnis hills. The topic of children is interrelated with the topic of language. It develops in the following. The prayer of the old believer's nun. Prayer is a genre of sacral language. The dreary homeland speech, probably the poem's name for the new Suet language, Suet Novoyaz, as we call it, and the end of the poem, the silence to which the children sway. Sacral speech is only possible when you are locked in a madhouse, and children who could be the hope for the future only remain with silence in their everyday gloom. The connotation of a closed madhouse space is usually negative, but in Vaičiūnaitė poem only in the madhouse there is still light. It is still possible to have a meaningful prayer in the speech that is untouched by the new language, by the Novoyaz. Otherwise, you have to move radically beyond the Soviet space, according to the poet, beyond time. Back then, emigration from the Soviet Union definitely reminded of death, since there was no hope of coming back, and the Soviet government tried to erase every memory of those that emigrated. Their names should not be spoken, books they published were removed from the libraries, and so on. In somewhat frivolous and exaggerated conclusion, I would say that Soviet poets felt enclosed in a glass coffin, restricted by bars of a cage, and real speech was only possible in a closed madhouse ward. By the time I finished this report, I have understood that I made a major mistake. At least one of the selected poets should have been completely and honestly Soviet. Maldonis is not the case. So far, I do not know how, if such a poet felt the closeness of so far, I do not know if such a poet felt the closeness of space, how that affected him is, if at all. I will aim to correct this mistake when writing the article. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for Donata, and maybe questions? Please, Bernard.
I have a question to you, Donata, and also to Akvilė with regard...
Maybe you can use as...
Don't you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, and please excuse me that the question is very general, in fact, but you were bringing in your paper together 1960s and 1970s in Lithuanian poetry, and at least on the basis of these three poets saying that more or less it was already very restricted space. From Akvilė's paper, I got a somewhat different feeling that, in my opinion, perhaps coincides better with what was going on in Latvian poetry, because 1960s, it was still more like a period of more or less optimism, at least being there. And I think the example, of course, Mihkelev was an official poet, but still the man, Žmogus from 1962, it's a good example, and I think Akvilė, your first example still pointed towards some kind of symmetry and possibility to live. And then towards the late 1960s, there came that kind of, I don't know, break or whatever you call it. At least in theater, you see that more absurd drama is coming in with we'll have a paper tomorrow on Mammon's Hunt, but also I think of Grušas Love, Jazz and the Devil, where you have already this image of in prison for insane people, and also the image of cage comes into Latvian, I think, literature. I would say in 1970s, we have with Albert Bell's specific novel called Būris, the Cage. So would you, at the end, and perhaps both of you could comment on this, would you see that the 60s were more or less the same, or the 70s, or still these decades were quite different? What would your comment be?
I think that a bit of line is 1968, the Prague Spring, and those poets of the now older, now most all of them are gone, but those of the generation of 30s, although Martišiūtė and others had some illusions, and it's maybe now we think how naive they were, but still Prague Spring, they had some illusions that Soviet system could be improved. Prague Spring was the end of the illusions, and you see the cases are very, very different. And those poems of Maldonis were not published at the time. That also says something about that. And for me, it's very strange that this prayer in the Madhouse by Rita was published in 1984, as if, I have already said, as if censors were not able to read really what poet says. I don't know. I think a bit that we can find different cases if we have such a will. And as I was not able to, the space is a grand topic, as I was not able to put much more in my 20 minutes, I have just chosen some poems, and that's all.
I will just add something to Donata's answer. First of all, thank you for the question. To answer it is not easy, because while reading those almanac volumes, I got a picture of those decades that. Especially bearing in mind that the almanac was a channel or a platform for young and a little bit underground writers, poets. So it made an impression on me that they, they rocked. There are so many poems, pieces of poems that surprises me now. How come such verses could appear in those times? And it was very interesting to listen to Donata's presentation about the concept of space. And she commented on Antanas A. Jonyna's concept of space. And Antanas A. Jonynas is a young generation poem who wrote poems in absolutely surrealistic manner. And I thought that, wow, he's really brave and free. And what a contrast now to know that what Donata suggested, that his concept of space is really closed and very, very much reserved. So this allows to draw such a conclusion that at the same time there were different positions, different cases, and those differences overlapped. And this is how our consciousness probably operates. This is how our consciousness works. At the same time, we can speak that we are achieving freedom, we are free inside, but at the same time we follow very crucial regulations and live by absolutely different logic. So these things are reflected in art, in the poetry, and this is why it is so interesting to to try to find the ends.
And I will add one sentence. It's very strange that the censors had something they wanted to erase the line in one of Jonyna's poems that the railway turns westwards. That was bad to the censors because it's west. It's bad, but it was somehow not evident for them that when a poet speaks about a bed in the cage in the way I quoted, it's absolutely evident that the poet speaks about how he feels himself, but that was okay. You can only turn westwards.
It's more like a comment from Estonian literature. I don't know about poetry, but in 1979, Mati Unt wrote a novel, Autumn Ball. Maybe you have seen the movie. It has not been translated into Latvian or Lithuanian, but it is about building a Mustamäe district in Tallinn, a panel town. And the novel suggests that people should live inside this district. It's a closed district. And there is one character, is the real Estonian architect and artist Leo Lapin, and he suggests even that there should be the cemetery in the middle of this district, that people should never leave this place. So a kind of really closed space. Thank you.
And I can add about space. My paper will be tomorrow, but the turning point in Lithuanian drama was 1967-1968, and how to say, the brightest example can be the play named The Pit, Duobė, The Pit. And people are living in pits, and so, but about this will be tomorrow, but this is in 1968, and it's interesting that in this turning point participated students of the art academy, painters and writers in this same. So tomorrow we'll continue this dialogue about images in this 70s. So thank Donata. And in our next paper will be recorded, and Anneli Mihkelev from Tallinn University. She recorded a paper about stagnation and innovation in Estonia poetry during the 1970s, 1980s, poetry and theatricality.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to speak about Estonian poetry, more exactly poetry and theatricality in 1970s till 1980s. 1960s were golden years in poetry, music, drama, and visual arts in Estonia. But Estonian researchers still believe that the high tide of radical textual innovations actually occurred in the period 1968 to 1972. At the beginning of the 1970s, Estonian poetic language becomes more metaphysical. Unable to express the ideas directly, poets conveyed them through suggestion and connotation. The poetic language became more ironic. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to speak about Estonian poetry, or more exactly poetry and theatricality in 1970s till 1980s. 1960s were golden years in poetry, music, drama, and visual arts in Estonia. But Estonian researchers still believe that the high tide of radical textual innovations actually occurred in the period 1968 to 1972. At the beginning of the 1970s, Estonian poetic language becomes more metaphysical. Unable to express the ideas directly, poets conveyed them through suggestion and connotation. The poetic language became more ironic. Wordplay became more important, and the borders between poetry and prose, literature and folklore were blurred. The rhythm and style of Runo's song, the 8-syllable verses became more and more popular. The borders between literature and folklore became less distinct. The best example of this is the work of Hando Runnel, our poet who was born in 1938. Runnel was one of the main poets of the literary resistance movement. I'd like to analyze Runnel's poetry from the collection Punaste õhtute purpur, The Purple of Red Evenings from 1982. It's translated into Latvian also by Gintarė in 1998. Here we can find social, ethical and tragic poetry about homeland, which expresses the problem of Estonian national identity and the collective memory of the nation. Its primary concern is how to save Estonians' homeland and national identity. But although Runnel's book was published, criticism of it was prohibited. At the same time, many poems from the book became well-known popular songs, which eventually took on the status of folk songs in Estonian culture. For example, one of the Runnel's best-known songs is the sixth poem, The Land Must Be Filled with Children, or Old Song from the Circle, A Beautiful Land. And it's also significant that every poem in this circle ends with the following refrain. Beautiful, beautiful is the land, beautiful is the land I love. The situation was paradoxical. Everyone knows these poems and songs, although they were officially forbidden. The poetry book, The Purple of Red Evenings, was the book saved as a little package together with propaganda books, and the books which were not very popular, like maybe the books by Brežņeva itself, his trilogy, Male Zemlja, Rosavstenia, Itselina, from 1978. By the way, Brežņeva got Lenin's Prize from the book in 1979. Actually, the real authors were a group of journalists, not Brežņeva himself. Although the verses, Runnel's verses, also suggest the idea of homeland, again the author doesn't specify which land he means, giving him a good defense against the censor. This also made the poem comprehensive to people from different lands and contexts. The poem is also a very well-known song, made famous by the band Justament in the 1980s. It was especially popular during the singing revolution and remains so today. Interesting, Johanna Runnel writing bears similarities to the work of Kalju Lepik. The poet who was a rebel against the occupying power in Estonia and a poetic innovator while living in exile in Sweden. Lepik imitates Estonian alliterated words, causing borders between the past, present, and future, and between the poetic and real world to disappear. We can see similar tendencies, the imitation of folk songs and the Estonian alliterated words in Runnel's poetry in the 1970s. It seems that these innovations, which were made by Estonian poets in exile in the 1950s and 1960s, came to the homeland a bit later. Although state borders were sealed, cultural contacts still existed between writers living in the homeland and those in exile. Under Runnel's and Kalju Lepik's poetic styles are very close in that both styles are very national and borrow stylistically from folk songs. Written in the homeland, Estonian alliterated words in poetry reveal what has been hidden in the collective unconscious of the nation. Although similar tendencies existed in the work of Estonian poets in exile, poetry written in the Soviet Estonia was more ambivalent because it continually had an outwit censorship. This national style was innovative, according to Estonian researcher Aušra. Runnel's poetry can be seen as postmodernist in the way that it borrows stylistically from Estonian alliterated verse and folk songs and imitates the local romantic style of the 19th century. But it an easygoing and at times ironic way. And the next author is Valveri Krumo. He was born in 1942. And Krumo was another very important poet from the same period. He was very significant in the end of the 1960s He was a symbolic figure from the Estonian poetry of the 1960s. He became called our Pauleerik, the hero, according to Lauri Sommer, another poet. After 1968, Rumo's poems were printed mainly in periodicals, and for 17 years he did not publish a new collection of verse. In 1932, he assembled a manuscript collection of his poems written between 1968 and 1972, called Theatricality. The sender address was remained unpublished at the same time because of political censorship. Rumo attempted to distance himself from this role, the hero's role. These works were printed only in 1985 and 4 years later, 1989, as a part of the two later collections. Lauri Sommer has written, colloquial, demystifying, and socially acute. This collection was censored and remained unpublished until 1989. This led to deep disillusionment in accomplishing author, and he remained silent for over a decade, never producing a new collection since instead he has established himself as a brilliant translator, rendering into Estonian works by Donne, Pushkin, T.S. Eliot, etc. Kaveri Rumo was one of the major authors of the Estonian poetry innovation of the 1960s. His poem, Hamleti laulud, Hamlet songs, was published in 1964. In his second collection of poetry, Tule ikka mu rõõmule juurde, always come to my choice. The most influential part of the play is Hamlet in the famous monologue of Prince Hamlet, and Rumo's poem also refers to the same monologue. To be or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet's monologue expresses a complicated situation in which there is no good solution, and the protagonist thinks about what to do, to be a rebel or to be a conformist, and this is an existential question for him. Kaveri Rumo and other Estonian poets adapted to the surrounding reality, but attempted to change it, using the artistic world they had created, which was based on personal memories and historical memory and the existential rebellion. Kaveri Rumo focused on the idea of freedom, which was more important to him than any risk of adaptation. Personal and social motives and interests are connected in Rumo's poetry, and his own pains represent the pains of all nations. The first strophe of the Rumo's poem, Hamlet songs, establishes a dangerous and threatening atmosphere. Something is ominous, and nature creates a tangible feeling of fear. The cutting grass and the child who has injured his hand on the cutting grass represent that situation. It's an inexplicable feeling. The atmosphere is quite similar to the atmosphere of Shakespeare's play. The next lines of the poem introduce an unexpected contrast. A couple of lovers who run fearless along the beach barefoot and in their veins wind wine, sow grass, oh friend, sow grass. The lovers express positive and optimistic emotion in the poem. They don't fear the stormy sea and cutting grass, although they felt dangerous. The second part of the song sounds like an answer to Shakespeare's protagonist Hamlet. To be or not to be, and answer is yes, to be, certainly to be. Between those lines above, the lines in brackets and italics repeat as a refrain. Oh, only one lap on which to rest my head. Most probably the refrain alludes to the contradictory and tense dialogue between Hamlet and Ophelia in the second scene in the third act of Shakespeare's play. Although there is a dialogue between Rumo's and Shakespeare's text, the meaning of Rumo's and Shakespeare's text are opposite. Rumo's text was written at the beginning of the 19th in Soviet Estonia, but it sounds like a hippie poem from USA or Western Europe, in the mid-1950s or 1960s. The composer Velja Tormis wrote the choral The Song of Hamlet in 1965, words by Paul-Erik Rummo. Tormis' music and Rummo's text express the dialogue between nature and the human being, and also Rummo's poetic ego, which identifies with Hamlet in this poem. The same Rummo's poem has also influenced Estonian theatre. The performance Hamlet's songs directed by Mati Unt, staged on the 14th of April in 1978. That performance dealt with Estonian poetry from 1960s to 1970s, not only Paul-Erik Rummo works, but also other Estonian poets. It's significant that the motive of Hamlet became a symbol which connected different Estonian poets and poems. And the third author is Johanna. He was born in 1948 and committed suicide in 1995. Johanna Wieding's innovations occurred in the 1970s and later. Wieding's urban poetry represented something new in Estonian culture, which generally saw peasant culture as a source of essence of Estonian national identity. He is a professional actor in the Estonian drama theatre, and he used the pen name Jüri, which is more just a pseudonym. This name represented the author's unconscious expressed alter ego, and one of the main roles in drama theatre, Johanna Wieding's or Hamlet. Theatricality was one of the main features of Wieding's poetry. He became a living legend who is expressed manner of reading and singing his poetry. Theatre is more than a motive in his poems. According to Aušra, theatre is the same as life, or more precisely, an allegory for life itself, the border between illusions and reality, dreams and the waking world. The work of these poets, as an example of intersemiotic process in literature, the poems, which were traditionally published in collections, became more popular as national songs. Poetry was also closely connected with rock and pop music, which had an anti-Soviet essence. Parody, pastiche, and irony were the key words which characterized Jüri Wieding's poetry. He read or sang his poems himself, usually in the style of comic songs, couplets, or cabaret. For example, in the poem Ha Ha Ha, a play, comic in Estonia, from the 1974, the title indicates that it's a comic song, but the final interpretation and meaning depends on the performance in which the author sings and or reads his poem. This poem is also very well known as a song by the Estonian rock band Ruja. Although on the surface level, it's just a comic song. In the context of the Soviet period, it can be read as a totally ironic text. While each story is about minor, silly, and amusing situation, it also seems that the text is trying to play with the reader's sense of humor. The situations depicted are similar to the common in-law prose, a type of rude comedy, which combines tragic and comic elements. It's also ironic that the only thing that makes people laugh in this type of rude comedy is clearly a tragedy. Finally, there's a self-irony in the poetic ego that reveals in these situations. And conclusion. All these examples mentioned above demonstrate how the borders between poetry and prose, literature and folklore, literature and music, and even different genres were in Estonian culture, based in the 1970s and 1980s. Estonian literature and culture were exploring new ways to express forbidden ideas, the ideas of freedom and political resistance. The motives of folk songs or runa songs and even motives from literary muse like Hamlet conveyed connotations, as the main ideas or messages existed between lines, and one of the main features of the literature during the stagnation period is theatricality. Thank you.
We see some similar things in Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian literature, and among these images is space and color and intertextuality, Shakespeare, Hamlet. So this is interesting that similar things split in imagination of different countries. And we have 15 minutes, so the last paper also will be recorded, and we can maybe to discuss about your impressions from this Anneli paper. Or maybe we can invite Gintarė Bernotienė to read her paper about color, manifestation in the sacred and metaphysical treatment in poetry. Sigitas Geda, Jonas Juškaitis, and Leonardas Gutauskas in the same period, 1970s, 1980s. So maybe we can listen, and after that maybe we can make some conclusions.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues of this renowned Baltic Scholars Conference in Riga. With warm greetings from Kaunas, I am starting my presentation, which titles is You Were There, O Soul, Color Manifestation of the Sacred and Metaphysical Treatment of Flora in Poetry of Geda, Juškaitis, and Gutauskas in 70s and 80s. During the first decade of Brežņeva era, the potentiality of Lithuanian literature was increasing. Poet Cornelius Platelis has called the period from 71 to 72 the threshold when socialist realism got a death blow and modernization of literature, especially poetry, gained momentum. The poets who realized this breakthrough had debuted after 1960. Judita Vaičiūnaitė, Leonardas Gutauskas, Jonas Juškaitis, Marcelijus Martinaitis, and Sigitas Geda, who did not turn their work towards social progress or other ideological themes, but instead sought aesthetic novelty. Vaičiūnaitės, Gutauskas, and Juškaitis' second poetry collections, and Geda's the very first one, were characterized by an intense color perception of the world, while in the oeuvre of the men mentioned here, the ecstatic experience of being in color linked to the poetics of visions and the religious treatment of the landscape. I've analyzed the sacralization of the landscape of the homeland as a countercultural gesture and the recurrence of metaphysics in the poetry by Geda, Gutauskas, and Juškaitis in 60s and 70s. Today, I look at the ways in which color conglomerates of images participate in the experience of the sacred. My previous study highlighted the representation of plants related to color and to the problems of reincarnation, embodiment, or guessing one of the gods' names. In this paper, I'll explore the metaphysical treatment of Flora and the association of plants with the soul, and will refer to 9 collections of poetry published between 1772 and 1884. In his cycles Glacier, the White Thunderstone, and the Waning Moon, the Autumnal Goddess, Geda treats plants as forms that embody different experience of the divine. Example, he associates the torment of Jesus Christ with that of the flax or the rye, the nettle with the mystery of love, the transmigration of souls as an otherworldly existence that he imagines only in color rather than in a particular image. Return for a moment to the nettle overgrowth by the fence, to the distant azure purple, to the clayey rose, to the voice of Oriole. The mouth made of snow forever forbids me. His poems mention many plants: lilies, lilacs, burdock, rose, spruce, nettle, rhododendron, flax, etc., which we can relate either directly as symbols, example, the rose, the lily, or merely by association to some form of the divine. Example, the violet refers to God by its three-lobed leaf. Geda also mentioned plants as accompanying human existence, as being related to human by kinship. In the land, not that one, you were my sister, burdock, the vegetal soul of the plant, which Plato did not recognize. Here Geda refers to an important element in his perception of the world, Aristotle's concept of the soul, which influenced the mysticism of early medieval Christianity, according to which the soul has a nourishing basis, characteristic of plants, which are capable of dying, growing, and giving birth, sentient one, characteristics of animals, and thinking one, characteristic of humans, as well as Aristotle's summary of idealistic Greek pre-Christian philosophy on the transcendent nature of a prime mover, that supreme form of all forms to the world. End of quotation. The idea of God's transcendence to the world has based on the negative theology of the Neoplatonist Dionysius the Areopagite, and particularly relevant to the depiction of the landscape was his assertion that it is not God who can be comprehended, but only the place where he is. Not every reader or critic was able to trace the origins of the metaphysical thinking that stirred the poet's imagination during the stagnation years, the evidence of which was the reception of Geda's poems. Actually, publicly raising the question of God's existence, its reflection in philosophical tradition or any theological question, could have turned into a clue for the authors and the reason for the ban of their works. Although censored, the collections were nevertheless published. Their partial incomprehensibility resulting from a materialistic outlook was discarded as poets' tendency towards the esoteric, and their idealistic sense of place is still beyond the reach of Lithuanian literary scholars. Therefore, it makes sense to look into the development of metaphysical ideas and see what concepts and authors influenced the poet's worldview at that time. From Aristotle's reflections on the soul, that which must have entered Geda's horizons was the purposefulness of action, intelligence, attributed to the soul, and its connection to form, rejecting the earlier Pythagorean idea of the separation of the soul from the body, its transmigration and immortality of the soul. This idea goes back to the beliefs of ancient civilizations, ancient Egypt and India, in the existence of the soul after death, its reincarnation. Geda did not abandon the controversial treatments of the immortality of the soul that inspired the theologians of early Christianity, apparently partly influenced, Geda partly was influenced by the native religion of the ancient worlds. Without departing from the problem of the soul, it's useful to recall Plato's adoption and rationalization of the Orphic Pythagorean esoteric perspective, based on Egyptian soteriology, in which, as Algis Uždavinys writes, the soul is no longer considered a ghost or a ghostly second, as Homer depicted it, but is thought to be immortal, like the Egyptian Ba, destined to be transformed into a pure intellectual light, Ak, which is the authentic existence and immaterial and divine essence, which is transferred out of illusionary prison-like body and reintegrated into the divine sphere of eternal archetypes. After the esoteric poems by Geda came out, Geda, filling in a questionnaire that the poet Nijolė Miliauskaitė drew up, listed the early medieval Christian metaphysicians who had influenced him and his circle of friends, and Gutauskas too, and also shared his own profound experience, which reflected metaphysicians' viewpoint. Sometimes I am sure that once upon a time, somewhere, I've seen and experienced another reality where the forms of all plants and animals and people were different. That this had to be said with human melancholy and longing. Then I want to leave from here with my soul for an infinite and strange journey. The grasshopper, the lamb, the cow, the rooster, the hen are so beautiful to me. Of the haps, nettle, stellaria, accusatum, as reincarnated souls, how beautiful the people who turned into them must have been. Geda's cycle, the waning moon, the autumnal goddess, is a vision of such an infinite journey, beginning with an exclamation after an address to death, O golden gleam, who played with our souls, heaven without end, O lure of the distance. In the perspective of the universe, the speaker names the reincarnated souls, as we should understand them, the god's grasshopper, friend pigeon, nettle overgrowth, sister sedge, southernwood, and roses. That which unites the speaker with them is a passion of togetherness, and he describes the natural forms by color and light, which have characteristics of both the light of sensual reality and mystical light. The speaker conveys the greatest intensity of existence by the flowering state of the plant, which Geda imagines as a crown of a deity, a diadem in bloom and a voice you promised to the gods, O land, while the voice indicates the origin of the soul at a higher level. Following Aristotle, the criterion of voice as transmission is another manifestation of the soul's inherent purposiveness. Citation: the transmitter of sound is a being with the soul, and moreover, one whose activity is accompanied by certain images, since the voice is a sound which has a certain meaning. End of quotation. The phrase, a voice you promised to the gods, refers to the eloquence of multiple forms, which are spoken by that which transcends them and which through them is linked to a space. Compare Gutauskas lines. O voice that molders in a reed pipe of Alde. In the mysterious pilgrimage of Geda's poem, the recognizable landscape is characterized by longing. You were there, O soul, while the former connection to the place as a form of remembrance is evidenced by the spirit of a deceased embodying the affection for the inhabited place. In addition to the intense experience of place and the experience of the great being spirit enveloping the place, in his cycle of poems, Geda also reveals visions of time through the place, appearing in the conventional symbolism of the seasons, but also as abandoned landscapes, fire abysses, sandy outcroppings, the bones that the silver seas have washed ashore, with the latter image containing a hint of a transformative alchemical process. The sequence of death and rebirths depicted in these autumnal songs, or as Geda put it, the manifestation of beings, is part of great mysterious rhythm of the universe, in which the contours of timelessness, eternity, and time cover each other up. Geda and Gutauskas relied more on the Neoplatonists, while Romanticism, the last epoch of metaphysical European culture, whose authors imagined that the real world was not the visible, audible, and perceptible one, but rather the eternal and infinite world of the soul, had an impact on all three poets' worldviews. I could give you a whole number of quotations in which they use the broad spectrum of color blue, the key to Romanticism, to represent indescribable mysteries. Geda. All the peaks of the world are light blue, all that you cannot reach. Gutauskas. The threatening wholeness of the time will be continued by a glassy light blue shore. And most earthly Juškaitis love a blue angel flying out of our eyes. In terms of the problems of the soul and the development and influence of metaphysical ideas, it's important that the idea of the one, which the Neoplatonists and their followers developed, was most impressively conveyed by Novalis in his novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen as a vision of symbol of Romanticists' longing and the blue flower, the celestial bloom in which the world's spirit and the noble prototype of woman unite. Meanwhile, in Romanticist philosophy proper, the question of the soul had become a reflection on the relationship between life and the divine, which led to the abandonment of the concept of metempsychosis, transmigration, at the expense of the other concept, the one of the transformation of the ever-present soul as the part that cognizes that the experience, that cognizes the existence into the question of the organ, which is also characterized by cognition. As Leif Weatherby has shown, Romanticist organology has developed a number of concepts related to the problem of the mediator. It took from Aristotle's treatise on the soul the concept of the senses and as an instrument of perception, the treatment of the body as an instrument of the soul, the treatment of a soul as an organ, the human being, which Schelling called the organ of God, and poetry, which the Romanticists praised as the organ of cognition. Not all of these changes in thought influenced the poetry, even though they belonged to the same tradition of metaphysical thinking that acknowledged the interconnectedness of the world. Going further only into plant-related imagery, I'll at least mention Gutauskas' conglomeration of constant related metaphysical images: light blue, time, wind, shore, light, flower, blossom, bird, garden, that convey through visions of time a belonging to the infinite rhythm of the universe and the great cycles of disappearances and returns. In this perspective, plants embody a more universal form of existence than human beings. When Gutauskas writes, "Beyond the boundary, we should believe that our home is eternal like time, wandering on the seas, given over to the blooming of white gardens, beyond the boundary, rimmed with charred tracery of the shores of the hours that have flamed before our eyes." The vegetal vision of white gardens in bloom emerges as an image of timeless transcendence. The shortness of existence that the speaker mentions here, the shores of hours that have flamed before our eyes, contrasts eternity and ephemeral passing existence as the negative of each other or the shadow of each other, the charred tracery, which implicitly suggests that one can see the extinguishing existence and its changing forms on the other shore as eternity. Gutauskas' poetic visions are not bound by any character or story, but their basis is in the very anticipation of such an unrecognized experience that spiritualizes the visual forms and greatly expands the field of the sacred. Here, the entities are no longer united by a kinship that is common in Geda's poetry, but a much more distant, impersonal, and indirect relationship, which the Romanticists, in their problematization of the relationship between the life and divine, the question of the form and potentiality of life, which Aristotle referred to as entelechy, have dealt with. Gutauskas is sensitive to this potentiality of appearance of existence, not to the occasion, but only to the opportunity that one form of existence can offer to another. It is not true that a mysterious coolness is close to you in the nameless flow of life, which foreshadows the paths to seeds. We can find the same intellectual sense of participation in the nameless flow of life in the lines by the poet Gediminas Jokimaitis, who was a deportee. Even if all the seedlings burst into leaf, I will only be the wind that has brought them. The aspect of future that emerges here suggests a suspended existence in the present and highlights situations of postponement and non-participation. From a historical rather than a supratemporal perspective, Gutauskas incorporates these situations into esoteric reflections of the human condition. It is the fallout of allotted possibilities. For example, come down, my heart. We are full of desire. We will sink into the crystal wind. We will remain unnamed, silent, and in the fire of the past, indistinguishable from the flaming blossoms of the southernwood. They equate human and plantal existence with the plants in blossom elevated as the state of highest fulfillment. The projection onto the plant state of being contrasts the unfulfilledness of human existence, unnamed, silent, and refers to the experience of generational loss. Juškaitis' poetry, especially his landscape verse, is very down to earth. It is coming from real impressions, the places around the village where Juškaitis was born and where he returned to escape persecution shortly after his studies in Vilnius, before his first book was published. In his poetry, the images of the land are expressive and colorfully striking, and they also serve as witnesses to history, as he uses them to speak boldly about the recent past, the war and resistance. Even today, it's hard to imagine how the censors passed over a poem that captures this kind of experience. In Juškaitis' landscape poetry, the problematics of soul lack the element of reincarnation. Juškaitis was the most consistent of the three in adhering to the Christian doctrine and did not create pantheistic feelings of being reborn in another body or existence that keeps changing its forms. Juškaitis, when depicting the land or seeing it in his memories, often catches in these visions the glimpse of a being, a spirit or emanation hovering above the earth. The wind blooms on nobody's whistle, blowing the jingleness of the jingles. It was this kind of imagery that was similar to the poetics of the visions by Geda and Gutauskas. In the proximity of the land, they observe an animated, usually vegetal form. What is more for Juškaitis, the sense of divine presence pervades every substance of his poetry. In his landscapes, the connection with the depicted reality is so close that we can only recognize the sacred elements in the realistic and sometimes aestheticized picture of reality by the intense accents of color or light that permeate it. with which Juškaitis creates an impression of radiance, like in the fields that will get cracking to spread the silver on the sun. The experience of sacred has its roots in his mindful awareness that creation exists thanks to the Creator, which colors every his line. Juškaitis doesn't base his treatment of soul-bearing plants on direct analogy and identification, like Gedan Gutauskas do, but he mediates it culturally. Thus, in his poem Spruce on a Summer Night, the spruce tree, which serves as a metrocentric prototype of Baltic culture, appears to be sent. He supports this connection phonologically by the rhyme. Beautiful, before the lightnings burn out, in the mound a spruce, queen of the serpents. The mist were fogging for her, and the day was changing for night. Like a miracle, one star, serenity lightnings, as an almond, the time when the water is white and the herbs are blooming beneath her. In the hour of owl's eyes, it's in the old country of the north, darker than dark. He visually supports it by the similarity between the dark shape of the tree, shrouded in lightning and fog, and the mandorla. It is the time of the almond meaning mandorla. In Christian art, the mandorla has been used as a means of focusing and framing the sacred, and mandorlas often depict Jesus and Mary. In depicting the St. Spruce tree, Juškaitis repeats the same pattern as in his poem Summer Heat, where he depicts the lily, the herbs blooming beneath her, beneath the shrine pillar that's wrapped in grass like a tongue of flame, the lily of fields with petal here. And even the mother, the herbs have surrounded your shoulders and their shadows are at your feet. The epithet darker than dark that Juškaitis gives to the spruce tree is on the one hand an indication of its mysteriousness and similarity to the iconographic type of the Black Mother of God, Hodegetria, the one who shows the way. On the other hand, the context of the Baltic theogonic myth featuring the Queen of Serpents, especially one aspect of it, the transformation into a tree, is also relevant here, which justifies the rise of this conglomerate of images, mother, tree, scent, and the related phenomenon of North Country, the ability to represent the sacredness manifested by the light. And here, coming to my conclusions, I especially want to stress one sentence. I've tried to shed light on the philosophical and theosophical concepts of existence and soul that underpin these poets' reflection of the sacred in the landscape at the time when the landscape in literature was considered to be a bourgeois relic, a manifestation of nationalism and aestheticism. The rich layers of world culture, esotericism, and Christian faith, which were subject to exploration in discussions in small groups of like-minded people, in pre-war publications, or in art albums successfully brought from abroad, formed a specific perception of the world as an eternal metamorphosis, a picture of harmonious existence based on the poetics of visions, the genesis of which took on a distinctive quality from the archetypes of the ancient Baltic culture. In the poetry by Geda, Gutauskas, and Juškaitis in 70s and 80s, the metaphysical treatment of Flora was mentioned countercultural gesture to atheization and the impoverished worldview of the Soviet era. This unexpected continuation of the metaphysical thought that characterized Lithuanian poetry between two world wars and in the diaspora. He brought back to poetry the dimension of the sacredness of the landscape of the whole, the sense of the great cycles of the universe, and the connection of the individual with his native place, which was strengthened by the reiterations of extinction and rebirth. Thank you for attention.
So this paper was the last of this session dedicated to poetry of 60s, 70s, 80s. And maybe you have some comments. I can add that in 1968 in Lithuania, culture began some movements, still esoteric culture. Indian philosophy was published, drama plays of Lithuanian philosopher Vidūnas. This drama plays was connected with theosophical symbolism, and also begins the old Baltic culture movement Romuva, began to celebrate Rasos fiesta. So the old Baltic culture and Eastern philosophy, Eastern religions maybe made some changes in imagination, and metaphysical images began in poetry. So maybe the same movements was in Latvia and in Estonia in the end of 70s. So maybe we can discuss in our free time and coffee breaks. So till next session. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. Let's start the final session of this day. And we do have 4 papers here, and they all fall into the field called gender studies. And the first, I would like to welcome here Johanna from Tallinn University. Her paper is called Gender Conventionalism in Soviet Estonian Girls' Novellas During Stagnation-Era. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is this okay? Can you all hear me? So this is the title of my presentation. Gender Conventionalism in Soviet Estonian Girls' Novellas During the Stagnation-Era. And the so-called Stagnation-Era has been described as a period of return to traditional gender norms in the Soviet Union. I think this is sort of generally acknowledged. that traditional gender roles became the cultural norm again, especially the gender division of labor. And Finnish sociologist Anna Rotkirch has even proposed the term gender conventionalism. And by that she means an almost conscious longing for traditional division of labor, that the longing for certain invented traditions that we find in late and post-socialist Russia. And she specifies that she means two things. First, a support for gender roles that are perceived as normal and traditional, and secondly, an aversion against revisiting or reflecting on these gender roles. And as she also points out, I still quote, "In a society with a changing gender landscape, with increasing uneasiness over gender relations, gender conventionalism stood for a search after unquestioned, solid ground." But at the same time, the revolutionary rhetoric of gender equality persisted. This is somewhat in the vein of Alexei Yurchak. We could speak about performance of gender equality in the late Soviet society. But at the same time, Anna Rotkirch claims that the late Soviet people also tended to perceive the environment as if those revolutionary ideals of gender equality had indeed become true. Nevertheless, these two discourses clashed sometimes quite noticeably, and they had to be somewhat rhetorically reconciled. And I believe that the very popular genre of girls' novellas serves as good material for examining this idea. These books were very popular, they were widely read, even the ones that received a more negative critical reception. Probably at least partly because they fill the function of so-called mass literature. But these books often try to precisely reconcile the narrative of proper Soviet upbringing with a romantic tale of first love. And doing so, they cultivated a very noticeable antagonism of the sexes, especially visible due to the somewhat simple and didactic nature of the genre, which belonged to the youth fiction. So the so to say, ur-texts of Soviet Estonian girls' novellas are two stories by Silvia Rannamaa, Kadri and Kasuema, or Stepmother, and they were very widely translated. They both have been translated into Latvian. In 1966, both were published together under the name of Kadri Audžumāte. And Kadri has also been translated into Lithuanian. I don't think the second part has been, but and they have also been translated into numerous other languages of other Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries. And these are earlier texts from the so-called Thaw era, but I think they very much belong into the same story, in the story of trying to reconcile the emancipation idea with traditional gender norms and packing it neatly for young girls to take in. And Kadri and especially Kasuema use a diary-like narration, which often veers into sentimentality. And I think there is a noticeable parallel with Latvian book The Blue Sparrow by Anna Brodela. Rannamaa's protagonist has a very romantic nature. She writes poems and she dreams of white swans of longing, as she calls them, and so on. At the same time, the books promote a certain Soviet education discourse that is that aspires to be gender neutral and applies to both boys and girls. The books even contain such pioneer-like recommendations to wash oneself with cold water every morning and so on. And as I argue, pretty much the same story continues in the late 60s and 1970s books. This antagonism is, gender antagonism is reinforced and refined. And those are the texts that I have in mind, or the corpus. In those books, too, the narration often mimics the inside of the girl protagonist's mind. The book called The Last Book, Why Are You Silent? This book goes farthest in that direction. This is the only one of those books that is written in first person, and it also features all caps sections that represent the speech of the protagonist's imaginary friend, Gégé. But others are written in third person, and they do not resemble diaries form-wise, but they do follow the protagonist's inner monologues. And these monologues often, quite similarly, represent a young girl's doubts, fears, and dreams. So that's definitely a conscious emphasis on depicting the inner world of the protagonist and her often quite romantic fantasies. So, sorry, that was one step too far. I wanted to point out today some interesting knots in the plots of those books where the two discourses, this gender emancipation discourse and gender conventionalist discourse, where they seem to clash and are reconciled for better or for worse. And so the first 4 books, they form a tetralogy that is essentially dedicated to, well, I think the English translation is work experience education. It's trudavoja vaspitanie, or as I Googled it in Latvian, it should be darba audzināšana. I don't know if that's a common word. The first book is a bit different because it depicts the life of smaller children, primary schoolers. And I think this book goes to show that in the prevalent discourse, smaller children can be taught in gender-neutral terms. And the protagonist even often acts like a tomboy, but later in the series, those traits disappear. And on the picture, these are all the slides that are to follow are illustrations from those books, and they are all by the same artists also. Yeah, which does maybe not a very wide picture, but still. On the right, you can see the young tomboyish Silja being reprimanded by teachers for wearing jeans to school because she tore her dress while climbing a tree. And since her mother does not live with her at the moment, there is nobody to mend the dress. So she had to borrow jeans from the neighbor's boy. And also, she's being reprimanded for using a slingshot during a lesson, which both are conventionally boyish things to do. And I think it's also very telling that on the left you can see those female teachers with stereotypically feminine hairdos and pursed lips, whereas the good, understanding teacher is a man. And the tomboy seems to be a very popular character in Soviet children's literature, and I think this can be linked with the idea that the Soviet woman is, the early Soviet woman is very much modeled according to the Soviet man. But in this novel series, we are able to follow the change already in the very same book. This girl child, Silja, comes to the understanding that she needs to pay more attention to her looks. And by the end of the series, as we will see, she becomes a pensive, modest, feminine high school girl. When the very much loaded topic of work is discussed, girl protagonists may try their hand at the ideologically significant factory work, but after that, they tend to gravitate towards professions such as teachers, writers, artists, even more specifically, kindergarten teachers. Because the next 3 books in the list that I showed earlier, they all revolve around a party of high schoolers who go to summer practice in a candy factory. And to me, it seems that already the candy factory is a very interesting choice. It is a factory, no less, but it's producing candies, not heavy machinery or something like that. And the protagonist herself, the girl depicted in the picture, she aspires to be an artist, and finally she's assigned to sketch a new candy box design. So she too finds something better to do than this tedious line work. And Merla, the protagonist of another book, she finds her calling in nannying or childcare, and she loudly declares that machines are not for her after all. And in yet another book, the protagonist aspires to go and study languages, that is, philology. Although, to tell the truth, I have to point out that yet another protagonist is interested in astronomy, because astronomy and all things space seem to be so fashionable at the time that they seep into several works of youth fiction, and one of the earlier books even culminates with Gagarin's flight. More on the gender division of labor, positive male characters are perfectly able to perform domestic tasks. They are even very carefully shown to be able to do that. But it soon becomes apparent that the, so to say, natural order of things is it's a gender division of labor. And this is already seen in the earlier Stepmother by Silvia Rannamaa, with the boarding school seemingly teaching everybody to take care of themselves in everyday life, but with gender division of labor seeping in on instances such as the girls organizing a workshop of making dolls and asking boys for help to make doll furniture. And this is especially apparent in Silvia Truu's book series again. On the one hand, we are constantly reaffirmed that good male characters are able to, for example, to cook and to do laundry. On the other hand, this necessity arises mostly in situations where there are no women available. For example, if the mother of one of the boy characters dies, or when Silja herself is living only with her father because her mother is currently away studying in Moscow. The father manages to take care of the child and the household, but it is still shown to be like a notable exception. And he cannot, for example, mend this school dress that we mentioned earlier. And in the picture, you can see Merla and Jaak from the book Hello, I Was Looking for You. In that book, there is a very, to me, even surprisingly serious and harsh plotline with Merla's drunken stepfather, who, for instance, sometimes yells at her, now that your mother is not here, you will have to cook for me. And in the picture you see on the slide, Merla's friend Jaak is helping her to put a lock on the door of her room so that the stepfather cannot barge in. So he's helping her with something only a man can do. And at the end of the book, their budding romance between Merla and Jaak is confirmed when the boy compliments the girl. I hear that you make the best salad. But what is especially interesting is that in the second print of the book, it was sometimes in early 1980s, this compliment has been cut. Maybe the author changed her mind, I don't know. It was no longer fashionable to compliment a girl on her cooking skills. But what I would like to emphasize is that this ambivalence is a very common occurrence. In the case of the drunken stepfather, we saw that the idea was conveyed through a negative character, as if the author were criticizing it, but the criticism doesn't seem to prevail, because the same idea is manifest also in very many other situations. Another point is that well, not a very surprising point, is that girls generally behave better than boys in those books, and they are criticized more for smaller transgressions. And this double standard is often pointed out in those books, but it nevertheless remains in place. And this quite expressive picture depicts a scene with Reino and Merle. The girl is looking for a room to rent to escape her stepfather, and the boy has promised to show her a room, but starts to harass her and to talk about them living in that room as a couple. Merle feels very angry and violated and leaves. And later, the same boy, Reino, starts stalking her. She asks her friend Jaak to protect her and tells him what happened. And in response to that, Jaak starts very stereotypical victim blaming. And Merle again, she defends herself angrily, but the case is sort of left open. I would say that again, a peculiar ambivalence occurs. And this dynamic also goes back to Silver Rannama's stepmother, where a mock trial is put up because all the girls of the boarding school collectively accuse all the boys of bad behavior, cussing, disrespect, and even drinking and smoking. And there's also the character of a bad girl, whose, Melita is her name, whose badness stems from her going out with boys and flirting. And the boys use Melita as a negative example, and the girls in turn accuse the boys of corrupting Melita. But at any rate, she's supposed to be the gatekeeper of virtues, it appears. And the 1969 novella, The Balloon, by Aino Pervik, this is wholly dedicated to the case of a senior schoolgirl going to a restaurant, drinking a bit, and then going to a hotel room with a stranger while on a class trip to Riga, actually, which seems to be a deviant place as depicted in the book. Nothing special happens in the hotel room. They just listen to an LP record, but nevertheless, the whole thing is blown into a huge scandal. The girl is threatened with expulsion, and the class is tasked with re-educating her. Contrary to earlier Soviet narratives, the re-education turns out to be misguided, and the author seems to mostly side with the girl, but again, she doesn't take quite a clear stance. And this book, The Balloon, actually caused a small polemic in contemporary media. The reception was mixed, and there were many contrary reviews. And actually, most critics found the book to be unrealistic and too naive, because everybody knows that a high school girl drinking a glass of wine is nothing out of the ordinary. And those critics tended to say that both the problems and the characters in the book are boring and unlikable, basically. But there were still readers who were seemingly sincerely outraged. Maybe girls these days do act like this, but they should be condemned, and the author doesn't condemn it enough. The reception was a bit surprising for me, but I think it can be interpreted according to the same pattern, that the double standard between sexes is genders, yeah, is what I mean, is pointed out and challenged, but very meekly. It's challenged very meekly, and it nevertheless remains in place. And yeah. As perhaps a side note, drawing on autobiographies, the same Anna Rotkirch points out that there is a very strong ideal of romantic courtship in late Soviet society. Men and boys have to act gentlemanly, bring flowers to women and girls, and premarital sex is mostly frowned upon. And I think especially at younger age. And the same ideal is very much present in these books. Definitely no sex, and girls are the ones who are supposed to be the gatekeepers. By the way, if I remember correctly, I think that in Anna Brodela's Blue Sparrow, the girl actually did spend a night with her boyfriend. But I don't know if this is a national difference, or is it that she had just graduated from high school and therefore it was allowed, so to say. But to me, the most curious case is that of the two Estonian girls' novellas from the late 1960s, 1970s. They based their plot wholly on the idea that men, even high school boys, simply won't talk about unpleasant things. And the picture depicts Silja and Indrek from the hidden side. There's this strong and serious boy looking forward and the pensive girl by his side. The book depicts a relationship between a junior girl, high schooler Silja, and a senior boy, Indrek. And Indrek's mother dies, which means that he's on his own now and has to earn a living. He decides to still finish school while working nights at the already familiar candy factory. But the crux is that he decides to keep all this to himself, lest others should start feeling sorry for him, which he couldn't stand. So even his girlfriend, Silja, remains very puzzled as to why she never sees him anymore. And Silja is left wondering whether they are even still together, all the while Indrek is quietly planning their marriage. And finally, everything is cleared, but the author seems to have very few qualms about the boy character's, I would say, weird behavior. Instead, it is revealed that his silence had a noble cause, and this makes for a happy ending. So, while the book series began with a brave tomboy as a protagonist, it ends with emphasizing a fundamental difference between boys and girls. And the target group is girls who are taught that they need to be understanding when boys act like this. And the other book, Why Are You Silent?, is even more, I would say, hardcore. We find a similar situation in that a high school girl, Bianca, is left wondering whether she is or isn't in a relationship with a classmate. And the boy appears and disappears without any explanations. When they do meet up, he keeps long stretches of silence, sometimes saying just something like, it's so good to just be with you, or something similar. And it finally turns out that while the boy does indeed fancy the girl, he has gotten a slightly older art student pregnant and has to drop out of school and marry her. And this is also framed as a noble cause. At least the art student is made out to be a much, much bigger culprit in the story. So this, to me, seems to be a case of a very strong gender stereotypical antagonism. Men won't talk and women mustn't expect them to. And so what I have presented to you today is very much a work in progress, because these contradictions between the gender conventionalist discourse and the emancipatory discourse themselves, these are not very surprising, and they are very well in tune with contemporary pedagogical and also psychological discourse. This, for example, these advice books, A Girl Becomes a Woman, and so on. As I said, it is perhaps noteworthy how clearly and brightly these contradictions manifest in these rather simplistic novellas. But it also fascinates me in a larger context in connection with women's novels of the same era, which I have studied before in my PhD thesis. Researchers of girls' literature have pointed out that girls' fiction often contains very much the same tensions as contemporary adult women's fiction. And there is indeed something in common. Although the gender norm problems are addressed in a didactic or in adult fiction in a publicist manner, they are never resolved. Everything is very open-ended, and often the tensions are expressed in direct speech by one character or another, and the author never takes a stance. And yeah, this has been argued to be a characteristic of the whole Stagnation-Era Estonian literature. And on the one hand, it simply marks surpassing the simple socialist realist schemes, but on the other hand, it seems to yield an unsatisfactory and a muddled result. And to wrap up, I just have a request to all of you. I would very much like to find out more about similar novels in Latvia and Lithuania. If you noticed, I mentioned Anna Brodela's novella in my talk, and I think there are more. Of course, I do have a problem with a language barrier because I have only studied Latvian for a year, but and I have no Lithuanian at all, and few works have been translated. But still, if you happen to know any resonating works from Latvia or Lithuania, or if you are even interested in similar topics, please contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Johanna, for your very nice analysis of these novellas. And since you opened the survey, I can respond. What rang my bells was Zenta Ergle. Does she fit like this? She has trilogy, I guess, which starts among us girls talking, and I think it was 1970s or something when it was published. Then the next is something else, and the last was like 5 minutes before I met her. But literary scholars will tell you more. But Zenta Ergle definitely is this key figure in such genre. Okay.
I'll visit you with a pen later and ask you to put it in writing.
I'll Google the right link to the book. I don't know if it's translated. And yes, Lithuanians, do you have any book like that? Can you think of it now? But I had a silly question too. I followed all the lovely illustrations of the artist, and I was surprised that wearing jeans was just a regular thing. No, I mean, like having jeans in your closet was a normal thing in Estonia, because I thought it was something like, to look forward from the West, or...
Yeah, once you mentioned it, it was kind of surprisingly early, but I don't know, by the look of them, there might have been some do-it-yourself jeans or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, any other comments or questions? If not, so then thank you very much once again. Information will be updated. And from Estonian girls, we now go to Latvian women. So I would like to welcome here Sigita Kušnere from University of Latvia, Faculty of Humanities.
Hello. Okay. Hello. The image of Soviet Latvian woman in Latvian prose. My research interest in the era of the late socialism is probably related to the fact that I represent a generation that several researchers, when speaking of citizens of the USSR who were born and raised during the so-called Brežņeva-era, refer to as the last Soviet generation. I am one of them. In post-Soviet countries, it is still customary to call this time a period of stagnation, where in the Western tradition of research, this designation is often rejected as inappropriate. And I quote, "Stagnation, Gorbachev's term, has long been rejected. Developed or real socialism, the regime's own favorite label, can only be used with square quotes. The idea of applying the period names and concepts used in Western Europe and North America, the 60s and 70s, not only fails to reflect the wholeness of the Brezhnev period, but not least for all their practical use, these terms rapidly come up against limitations. Brezhnev's 60s were a continuation of the reforming optimist of the Soviet 50s, rather than belonging to the triumph of the consumer society as portrayed by the market economy countries. And yet, during this period, there is both the stagnation of the economy created by the Soviet regime and the related shortage of access to goods and services, and at the same time a desire for higher material welfare, which often significantly prevails over the moral posture of the Soviet citizens, highlighted in the official rhetoric, and the abandonment of material values as an essential feature of the firmness of character. Since the Soviet Union was not in position to satisfy the overriding welfare expectation of its citizens, yet at the same time there was a strong need to demonstrate the superiority of the socialist system in mutual competition with the West. The principle of the so-called socialist way of life was established, namely, articulated in response to the political disappointments of the late 1960s, as well as the economic reverse of the mid-1970s, the concept of the socialist way of life allowed the Soviet Communist Party to refocus competition with the West not on material condition and standards of living, but on qualities that were far more difficult to measure directly: moral values, emotional, interpersonal, or ethical. The introduction of morally ethical principles suitable to Soviet citizens in everyday domestic practice was also a particular concern for writers. It meant seemed that didactic guides were no longer representative of the literature of the second half of the 20th century. However, the principles set up by the Soviet system should be taken into account. One of the most important Latvian writers of the period considered this undeniable Regina Ezer. The novel Akvilė is one of the writer's most well-known works. The novel's popularity was also greatly influenced by the 1976 premiere of the movie Ezer Sonata, the Lake Sonata. Looking at the Latvian literature of this period, one can see a clearly marked transition from the canon of socialist realism and the general mood of didactically instructive themes and texts revealed, for example, in Ilse Indrans novel Lazdu Laipa, The Hazelwood Bridge, or in the long story by Lija Brīda, Kad dienas prasa atbildi, Days Require an Answer, as well as in Zigmunds Kuiņš novel Kolumba Mazdēls, The Grandsons of Columbus, to a more free statement of thoughts and deviation from the accolade of the reality of socialism in such works as Dagny Zigmunds' novel Ragans māja remontēs, The Witch House Will Be Repaired, and Regina Ezer's novel Akvilė. Paying attention to the image of women that is remarkable in Indrans' novel is that most of the schoolgirls live in boarding schools and their lives are as similar to each other as the clay was at the bedside tables. And I quote, "Once a girl placed a white porcelain dish in place of a vase, just like that for a change, and pushed the brown thing behind the mirror. The class mistress noticed this on the first morning. 'How that?' she asked, very disappointed. 'Did you break it? Then you have to try to buy the same thing.' The girls understood and removed the items in silence. Everybody has the same bed, the same bedspread, the same table and mirrors, the same apron and hat." End of quote. Literary text shows an undeniable desire to get rid of the leveling imposed in the first Soviet years. However, the text still continued to retain the didactics and modeling of the right choices. The Latvian prose of the era considered is a compelling material for reflection on the reality of social life, gender, social issues, lifestyle, education, occupation, family model, specifically highlighting the image of women. In the 1970s, the respect for the canon of social realism had already subsided, but even during this period, there was still a climb against art as a pillar of the morally ethical principles of an austere Soviet citizen. The text of fiction had to become the perfect model of the Soviet ideals. The idea of such a requirement is not just a hypothetical assumption, but it is also confirmed by historical evidence. Such a proposal written by the literary scientist Ilguns Bērsons to admit Regina Ezera into the Union of the Soviet Latvian Writers. And I quote, "The first deepest impression the member of the Young Communist League, Regina Ezer, is evolving into serious writer. And this impression has remained with me to this day. Ezra writes about the fighters of the Great Patriotic War, about today's heroes, politically and morally strong people, and being a struggle for influence on the consciousness of backward people. End of quote. A similar reference was made in a report of meeting of the Writers' Union when there was a discussion about Regina Cezar's candidacy to Writers' Union. The poet Ojārs Vācietis describes the new writer. One of the strongest and most sympathetic qualities of her talent, an energetic quest and the fundamentality of these searches, the principles of the search, the struggle for true and full representation of our contemporaries, the fight against pseudo-modernity, where the era is the background for very untimely performances. There are favors and exaggerations in this other's directions, but directions of the expression of talent is quite right. It was text from Vācietis. The right principles means efforts to shift the focus of a reader's morally ethical values from material values to the superiority of the morally ethical principles already mentioned, highlighted as a suitable to the Soviet citizen. This pattern encouraged the reading of fictional text to focus on representation of elements of everyday life, which both reflect the principle of the socialist way of life and allow for a deeper understanding and more accurate characterization of women's images. Through gender equality is declared in the Soviet Union, the prose text in question reveal a completely different scene. Namely, that men are better educated and later do intellectual work and hold higher position, as in the case in Ezra's novel, where a novel protagonist Rudolf is a doctor and Rudolf went to conference in Moscow. In Dagny's Zigmund's novel, and I quote, "The husband is a journalist," Guna said. "I am absolute mortal, I work in a store." End of quote. The text discussed a number of saleswomen, secretaries, also housewives. Higher education is less desirable for young women than for young men who make their own choices and plan to become architects, engineers, or aviation professionals, while girls after graduating high school follow parental requirements, start a job as a salesperson, go to work in agriculture, etc. The girls also chose their studies according to their parents' wishes. The profession of a doctor or an actress are mentioned as suitable career for a young social woman. However, talent and certain personality traits are necessary, so not every girl has this path to go. And of course, a teacher's profession. The teacher's noble work of rising as a new Soviet citizen is emphasized, for example, in Indran's novel, also in Brīdīkas story, and in Ezra's novel too. In Brīdīkas story, typically for the time, and therefore it is very noticeable and instructive, female images have been assigned leadership roles. A woman chairs the executive committee of a small city, and it is an essential position in the structure of Soviet authority, and a young teacher becomes a school principal. Yet the appropriateness of both women, the position is directly questioned, and the husband of the school principal points out, I quote, "This is what happens when the girls are appointed as principal and they start to get dizzy from their success." End of quote. In addition, the word girl in Latvian is used in diminutive form expressing contempt. Consequently, it is pointed out that although equality is formally respected, the woman is not suited for a high position and level of responsibility because she is too emotional, too open-minded, or childish. Guna, the protagonist in Zigmund's novel, is a bookshop saleswoman. And Guna reprimands her husband, a journalist. It was frivolous of you to marry me. Intellectually, I'm so far behind you. Intellectual inequalities between women and men characters are reflected both in professional choices and careers and in aspects of simply day-to-day issues, including, for example, in the selection of reading materials. Men's desks and shelves are filled with serious literature and scientific texts, while women read just some pulp fiction. The women who have not been educated and hold ordinary jobs have been portrayed in their everyday desires as down to earth, sometimes even limited, considering the opportunity to go from a food kiosk in the outskirts of Riga to a sales position in one of the city's center luxury shops as the highest point of their careers. Zsigmond's novel accurately describes the following desire. Sarma, why are you working as a salesperson? At the factory, the salary is higher, and when winter comes, oh, you will be freezing in that kiosk. The girl lingers for a moment, then, as if revealing his great secret, says, I like being a salesperson. I would like one day to be at a department store or at Sakta. On Sakta, that was the most luxury store in Riga that time. And Sarma, this young saleswoman, has a white work coat and white headscarf. The Sakta girls all have the same beautiful gowns, they hard on, with lips colored in different shades of pink. They swirl around the mirrored kingdom. One cannot believe that this girl at the Oscar kiosk dreams of it. In the same novel, the portrayed Guna is a saleswoman in a bookshop, and she observes, I know we can't live without sausages and butter, but I wouldn't be able to sell them. If only bread, but books. I was told I might be able to transfer to the science bookstore. This reflects the internal hierarchy of the profession, which is also typical of people working in the same profession or in the same outskirts of the city as if they were living in similar households. In the juxtaposition of the center and the outskirts, there is also an overly low description of the social inequality, of which I should even say it's amazing how such comments have slipped by the careful reading of censorship. Such as a small town description in Brīdekas story or Riga outskirts portrayal in Zsigmond's novel with long unrepaired houses, backyards full of weeds and poverty, characterized by the goods purchased at the food kiosk and the down-to-earth dreams about prosperity. And I quote, you have to save every step of the way. You have to eat fried potatoes and have to redo the same dress 3 times. This limited advantage can be contrasted with the principles of Riga Center Girls. Model Judīte. Judīte's life in Zsigmond's Skuiņš novel, The Grandsons of Columbus. And it's what Judīte think about her life. I'm used to living an easy life. I need a lot of things. I would not know how to walk in cotton dresses and wash the sink in communal kitchen. Austerity and limited financial means describe the woman's world. It is opposite of the opportunity of some fellow people dressing up and purchasing a car, while a normal average Soviet citizen looks at it all from the sideline, with undisguised envy. And it is the women who are doing extra work in the backyard garden to make more money, growing vegetables to be sold at the market, doing handcrafts to make their own clothes, and sewing old and worn-out dresses several times. Mothers of young women and men are also worried about the choices made by their children. And in addition to sexual desire or emotional and intellectual capability, a question is also raised about the material welfare aspect of potential marriage. Mothers urge their children to reflect on the consequences of the decisions they have made, to secure a future or give it to feelings and risk leading their future lives into poverty. Here too, there is contradiction with the opportunities for young people, young families proclaimed in the official Soviet rhetoric. Skujiņš novel presents the following dilemma. The young and beautiful Judith has decided to marry old but wealthy Šumskis, who, by the way, is still married father of 2 children, but the desire for the young woman seems to be stronger than marriage ties. And Judith rejects the main character of the novel, Lipst, who made the right socialistic choices. And I quote, "If you knew how I didn't want to, but you don't know my mother. On the one hand, she's right. You and I, we are not meant for each other. You are still very young. You still have to learn and conquer the position in society. We would be fighting scarcity and urging every day for money. I know myself, Lipst, counting kopecks, women are prematurely, they get ugly. Consequently, the choice of the young woman is also tied to her own desire to continue to live easily, to enjoy the opportunities provided by the material well-being, and various informal contacts even in Soviet system, which allow to overcome the general shortage of goods and services. During the socialist era, literary works played a vital role in shaping behavior, directing cultural and social practices, influencing social interactions, and constructing women's identities, and it was an important part in the socialist way of life process. In this context, Latvian literature assists Soviet institutional authorities in communicating the idea of the ideal of socialist woman, and argued that she became the crucial ally in implementing socialist idea in the everyday life of Latvians and allowed the Social Communist Party to refocus competition with the West, not on material condition and standards of living, but on qualities that were far more difficult to measure directly. Morals, values, the emotional, personal, or ethical. However, the daily life of the Soviet citizens represented in the literary works examined reflects the reality of life in which material values are undeniable, essential, and no matter so accurate and poetical the description of the right choices of Soviet citizen is, it contradicts with the people's desire, at least in everyday life, to strive for satisfaction and fulfillment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sigita. Well, any questions? Jānis. Not right now. I thought you were looking. Sigita, I have kind of just your opinion. The fact that these, how to say, fates of women appear in the literature of stagnation era, not like struggling with daily life or limited career choices. And so the fact that they appear in literature, isn't it already like social criticism, like not really saying this is how it should be, but kind of showing this how it shouldn't?
Yes, here is a difference. When the writer is talented, she or he can make this situation of everyday life, everyday practice very real. But in every of these texts are phrases or some sentences about the right choice, the Soviet citizens' principle of life. And there is
didactics, like
yes, there is didactic, but dissonance between the real life and how it must be.
Okay. And from such kind of feminist point of view, when I was listening to your paper, I remembered the documentary by Seletsks, maybe you know, Sieviete, kuru gaida, a woman who has waited for. So I think it's about the same time, 1978, and it depicts different women of that time. So a little bit.
In the end of the 70s and beginning of 80s, it's big difference between when we read a literature of 60s, and there is very big difference between 60s and 80s.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I think this question about is whole stagnation era the same? And I think it showed up in earlier sessions. Is 60s different from 70s and even more so 80s? Okay. Is anybody willing to add? Zita? Yes.
You have a question?
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you maybe noticed some difference between how Soviet female image was depicted by Skuinch and how it was depicted by Azara and Zygmunt. Was there any difference?
Oh, it's a good question. I don't have any right answer on this question right now, but I will think about it. I will think about it. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Thank you once again. Good luck with your studies. And now let me invite my colleague from Literary Department of the Institute of Literature, Folklore and Arts, Zita Kārkla. And she has a very poetic title of a presentation. You will probably see it soon.
Hello. I must say that this paper is a part of a larger ongoing postdoctoral project, Embodied Geographies, History of Latvian Women's Writing, where I attempt to explore female body as a profound concept within women's writing and social in historical context. When in the mid-50s, a new generation of women writers emerged in Latvian literature. In the beginning, their works features of socialist realism dominated, confirming pathos, orientation towards a bright future and social relations. However, starting from the 1960s, with the changes in overall literary scene, women authors also increasingly began to address women's private lives and experiences, voicing their opinions more or less openly. Not only home and family occupied center stage in their writing, but also the focus shifted from outside relationship to female protagonists' inner life and psychological struggles. In his study of literature of everyday life in prose of Russian women writers, Benjamin Satslev notes the persistent linking in the Soviet culture of everyday, corporeality, and the feminine, which suggests that women are inclined towards domesticity, childcare, and the endless need to support a family. And the main contribution of Brežņeva years to the woman question was the declaration that the woman question was unsolved. However, the discussions determined how women could combine production with reproduction without neglecting either role. And in this sphere, literature did reflect an issue of contemporary concern, illustrating the challenges women faced in coordinating their two spheres of responsibility. And Regina Azara, that was also mentioned before, was among the writers who in her prose predominantly focused on exploring the life of Soviet Latvian women, examining individual problems such as unhappy marriages and nature of everyday life, which she also used as a venue for commenting on often overlooked women's issues. While feminine worlds in Azara's prose are characterized by selfless love, care for the family, and glorification of motherhood, female characters are also aware of their double burden and delimiting roles. Around 1980s, as the general cultural atmosphere in Soviet Latvia changed, the next generation of women writers entered literature. By highlighting such social problems as poverty, alienation, violence, alcoholism, drug addiction, and others, they revealed more explicitly than ever before the dark side of Soviet reality, and Andra Neiburga belonged to this generation. And in her short story, she confronted also the reality of the late Soviet period, including women's monotonous unpaid domestic labor as one of the reasons for discontent of her female protagonists. As Sandra Meshkova writes, Neiburga introduced a new voice that expressed indignation, frustration, uncertainty, and inscribed a radically different vision of reality. Regina Ezera short story Stress that I will look at was first published in magazine Zvaigzne on May of 1974. And Andra Neiburga's short story Death of a Mouse was first published in magazine Avots in December of 1988. And both stories share similar themes, the drudgery of mundane everyday life of a female character. Overworked and lonely, the women in both stories live lives that seem repetitive and futile. They are trapped in circular activity, and they are used to suppressing their feelings and hiding their frustrations deep within themselves. I will look at those two stories from a gendered perspective by centering on the female embodiment and by drawing on the approach on the feminist critical studies of emotion and affects in order to explore links between body, emotions, and power. And I should also add that this is an exploratory account and should be viewed as a preliminary sketch for a further exploration and research. Feminist theory's engagement with emotion and affect dates back to 1980s, when scholars emphasizing the links between emotion, power, and embodiment showed how the work of oppression is often carried out at an affective level. Many scholars within affect studies distinguish between affect and emotion, usually regarding affect as embodied and considering emotion to be narrated and social. However, as feminist critics have noted, there is a slippage between these terms because it's hard to maintain distinctions between bodily intensities and social categories of feeling, between self and social, between private and public. And Sara Ahmed, one of the theorists building on these frameworks, examines how power works through affect to shape individual and social bodies. And in her works, The Cultural Politics of Emotion and the Promise of Happiness, Sara Ahmed also shows how emotions can attach us to the very conditions of subordination. And I will continue with a close reading of the two stories. Ezera's story, Stress, tells of a woman who returns home from the night shift in the gynecological department of the hospital. Her workplace links her both to the female body. The story also mentions that the night shift was very difficult because a woman after abortion almost died, and female function of a caregiver. She's a nurse at work and also at home, taking care of the needs of her family, and Ezera labels it a role of comforter. Although this main character, Elizabeth, is very tired and all she wants is to go to sleep, when she returns home, she has to take care of her family crisis because her husband has a toothache, and later, after a fight, her son also leaves the house and she has to go to look for him. Elizabeth's frustrations and entrapments are never voiced. She does not question or challenge her role or situation, but her frustrations are revealed through her bodily sensations. The story begins with Elizabeth leaving the work and waiting for trolleybus to go home. Her bodily reaction to fatigue, insomnia, and caffeine intake during the night shift is inner shivering. She's feeling very cold inside. I quote, "And now out in the cold, she felt almost like having a slight fever. Inside, something vibrated tensely, and her hands and feet seemed ice cold." End of quotation. When the trolleybus comes, it turns out that inside the trolleybus, it is almost as cold as outside. And there's a quote, "It was empty and very cold inside. The windows were covered with ice crystals that glowed gently on the sunny side. The cabin was filled with mate, pink and cold lights, in which the vapors of her breath flowed. Everything Elizabeth touched was also cold. The nickel-plated bar, the ticket machine handle, The dermantine-covered seats, and it intensified the feeling of cold. She squeezed in the corner of her seat and hid her head in the coat collar, which coldly touched her cheeks. End of quotation. Both the shivering inside and cold from the outside that moves from the surfaces into the depth of her body are physical sensations that envelope her. Feelings of cold is both connected to her fatigue after the night shift in the hospital and her feelings of isolation, alienation, and apathy that is also mentioned in the text when she, on her way home, stops at the market for the groceries. I quote, "And again, the background of this lively, colorful, and loud market, Elizabeth felt her own deep fatigue and apathy very sharply again." End of quotation. And Elizabeth actually is typical for Azores women who live under the double burden in unhappy marriages. As Ben Highmore indicates, the register of cold and of warmth is emotional and affective register. Affects marks a body's belonging to a world of encounters and a body's capacity to affect and to be affected. And if intensified feeling of cold in Azores' story also expresses unhappiness and awareness of the distance between Elizabeth and others, the opposite feeling are invoked when she thinks about warmth. And I quote, "She imagined things that had something to do with heat, bringing to mind a quilt, radiators, and even a thermophore, but she was still shivering. Then she imagines how good it would be if her husband and son welcomed her home with a cup of warm tea. The fulfillment of this modest wish seemed to her the highest happiness she would have desired today. However, this modest wish does not come true, because when Elizabeth returns home, she has to take care of her family members. Dead tired and deprived of sleep, she watches her son sleeping under a warm blanket. And the camel wool blanket and white bed sheets radiated subtle heat. At least Elizabeth thought that she felt it. She feels this heat coming from her son's blanket. And then she continues, thinking, "But when will I get in bed?" Elizabeth thought helplessly, already quietly settling for it not to happen so soon. She went into the kitchen and lit a gas to make some quick breakfast, and then she unpacked the groceries. Elizabeth is physically and emotionally exhausted, longing for warmth, empathy, understanding. However, she keeps her feelings to herself. She does not voice them, thus following emotional rules that help to maintain society's patriarchal hierarchies of gender. Later, when the missing child is found and her husband's tooth stops hurting, she concludes that everything is fine. She chooses to suppress her own emotions that are revealed in the story through sensorial perceptions of cold and warmth, fearing to disrupt the precarious security of family and home is also opposed to the coldness of the outside. Thus, she's accepting her socially imposed role in order not to lose this security. Neighborga's female character, similar to Azores' protagonist, experiences her everyday life as an entrapment. The reader of the story is addressed in the form of you, offering the opportunity to identify with the main character, pointing out that it is a shared everyday experience of Soviet women. And part of this quotation is also in the title of my presentation. And I quote, "You, maybe me, it does not matter because we feel and live alike, but if it is not so, don't read my story." It is a story about one morning in a woman's life against the background of every day in the 1980s. The woman wakes up on a summer morning. The other inhabitants of the apartment are in Jūrmala, and she is alone with her husband. They have white bread and coffee for breakfast. It is cool inside of the apartment, and then don't feel the scorching heat of the day yet. And then she notices a still alive mouse in a mousetrap. And woman becomes very emotional and cries. And she cries for a long time. And in the beginning, she cries about the mouth, then about her husband, then about herself, and then she cries about everything. And after crying, her stomach starts to hurt. Later, suffering from stomach pain, she is forced to get off the trolleybus In suffocating pain, she gets down on the asphalt, feeling as if she herself was a trapped mouse. Pain is a bodily response to the psychological prison of everyday existence. From Neighbor's point of view, the grey, hopeless life of a Soviet woman is like that of a trapped mouse. It is impossible to get out. In many ways, central to the story's exploration of women's everyday life is fear. Fear, like pain, is felt as an unpleasant form of intensity. I quote, "You are afraid of bad people, of police. You are afraid of war and of household radiation. And you have ordinary fear of trains, cars, engines, and electricity. You are afraid of everything you don't understand. You have not yet entered the century of technical miracles, but you are also afraid of nature. Darkness makes you quiver. The silence seems scary. You don't like to walk in the shadowy woods in the middle of the day. You don't understand the forest either. The most difficult are the nights, when the fear of darkness combines with the fear of future." As Sara Ahmed writes, the affect of fear is sustained or is even intensified through the displacement between objects. In the story, anxiety accumulates as during the trolleybus ride, women's thoughts move quickly between different objects, a movement which works to intensify the sense of anxiety. She thinks of more and more things to be anxious about. She's afraid of radiation and hopes that grandma does not let her child run around without a sun hat. She's afraid of pain and illness and death, and she's especially afraid of assault. You're afraid of violence. You don't want to be hit in the face. This is the worst thing you can really imagine. Her fear invokes physical vulnerability. The world itself seems a space of potential danger, a space that is anticipated as pain or injury on the surface of the body that fears. With the accumulation of anxiety, her stomach pain intensifies, showing fear, anxiety as embodied experience. And while the protagonist thinks that she can endure the pain by getting used to it, I quote, "But you can get used to the pain. You can get used to everything you think." End of quote. Well, she thinks that she can endure the pain. Pain escalates. Quote, "The pain subsided for a moment, grabs you with new vigor. The bluish, cold hand of pain with long, thick and yellow fingernails strangles you. You cannot bend, you must not bend, you must not allow the disgusting hand to penetrate even deeper into your insides. Patient, patient, you have to get it together." End of quotation. However, in the end of the story, the protagonist does not manage to get it all together. She's in severe physical pain, which causes the woman to physically shrink, taking up less space. She's on her knees close to the street level at the lowest horizontal point. Both Azar and Neighborga are interested in everyday life and embodiment, revealing that life, survival, is always already emotional, embodied, vulnerable, and relational. Showing female everyday life as a trap, they are both also aware of gender. Women characters in both stories live in the city, and their everyday lives are somehow similar. Shaped by double burden, they wait for public transportation, they stand in lines for groceries and other necessities. They are both dead tired from managing workload and housework and have problems with health. Both of them take medicine to ease anxiety or pain. They both feel lonely and isolated and tend to silence and suppress their feelings. A woman's everyday life, as it appears in both stories, is saturated with affect. Hidden frustrations are revealed through embodied feelings, showing inner tensions and discontent through shivers, freezing, fear, frustrations, weariness, and pain, sharing women's responses to the rhythm or burdens of daily life. However, if Azar's story centers on feelings evoked by female double burden, unhappy marriage, and alienation in relationships, then for Neighborga, the limitations of female protagonists are a small sample of the delimitations within Soviet society as such. Description of fear alert to the needs for social change, as well as points to why such change has not occurred yet. Introducing new topics and issues, Neighborga in her story discusses various social and psychological problems that could not be voiced before, also showing how power works through affect to shape individual and social bodies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sigita. Any questions from the audience? I do have, but I just don't want to be the only one speaker. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, for you and for Johanna and Sigita. I'm sorry, but I have a more general question, not directly related to your presentation. We, with our Lithuanian colleagues, during the break, we're just talking about Lithuanian literature and this interesting situation that we hardly, barely have prose writers in the context of Soviet times. So could you please elaborate more on the proportions of prose and poetry, on the proportions of significance of poetry and prose in the context of Soviet times? It's the question for you and for Sigita and Johanna as well.
Okay. Who will start? Sigita is right here, or Zita is ready. You will think a little bit.
In Latvia, there in this period, approximately 7 or 10 novels per year. It's not very big prose text material, and at that time, I think the poetry was more important because that underlines the deepest meaning of poetry. In Soviet time, if you was a poet, you have opportunity to say much more than in prose, and in prose is more this Soviet regimes this right thing. You must write about the brave socialist. Yeah, in poetry, not so. It's what I could say.
Thank you. Actually, such an interesting observation. I never thought of it. So you are more a nation of poetry. Yeah, I got it right. Okay. Would you comment on this?
Well, with regard to Estonian literature, sorry, I hope Ella-Mari will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that general scheme is that, well, there was pretty much nothing in the 1950s, maybe not very remarkable works. I think 1960s were a decade of poetry, and very many young and inspiring poets, but prose sort of came back in the 1970s, and there were two more important lines: historical prose and so-called model prose. Okay, that adds up.
Yeah, thank you. And Zita, finally, would you comment on this too, or you? Sigita already gave impression. I did have a question for you too. So, well, you provided this psychosomatic analysis actually of as presented in 2 literary works, and I was thinking, like, still today in 21st century, does the same pathos, or how you would call, appear to? Maybe I've noticed it a little bit in Inga Gaila's writing, or is it something gone away back in the history of female stories? Just like, are there literary works where females feel suppressed and sad by everyday life, mundane? Very generic questions about today's literature.
I think that you're right, that we can find it in today's literature as well. Inga Gaila is one example.
Inga Gaila. So these things don't change.
But also, about today's literature, there are a lot of works that look back in the past, writing about Soviet times. Inga Abele, Andra Manfelde, they are writing about Soviet reality, but probably more openly naming issues that were not voiced aloud in Regina Azer's stories.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, and by the way, I really liked your translations. Was it made by you or somebody?
Yes.
Wow, especially in Ander Neighborgs, but first quote, very smooth, I guess, in English.
You.
Okay, we will thank you very much. And we do have one more presentation, and it will be a special one because it will be streamed on internet. You know, it's autumn and migratory birds have gone elsewhere from Latvia, and so has our colleague Karls Verdiņš. It's early morning in St. Louis, Missouri right now. This was recorded some hours ago, as far as I'm informed. So let's enjoy the show.
Dear colleagues, I'm happy to join your conference from my apartment in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm going to tell you about 3 Latvian poems of the era of stagnation and what I see as interesting features regarding their treatment of gender. I will start with a poem by Latvian modernist Monta Krona, a poem from her collection Tuvplānā, Close Up, published in 1966. Her first really modernist poetry collection. And you can see this poem in my English translation. I hope it will make sense. Your brown eyes are almost black. They are tossing in the water near the bank in the Riga port, where black oil is flowing from big ships, running into 2 circles. Your eyes are black. They are tossing in the water near the bank in Riga port. They smell of oil and hard labor, and of the power of muscles and brain, and of wild desire. People's nostrils stop breathing and inhale this smell. Their eyes are shiny black. They're tossing in the water near the bank in the Riga port. Boys in swimming trunks are jumping out of them, one after another, endless they are. Boys in swimming trunks are jumping out of them. Oil flows over their shoulders, backs, legs, brown, almost black eyes. Your eyes are tossing in the water near the bank in Riga port. My poems, boys in swimming trunks, are jumping out of them. Hands of the people are opening. They are not afraid, neither oil nor hard labor, neither the power of muscles nor brain, nor wild desire. Hands of the people of my century are opening. As you can see, this poem is built on repetitions, but it's not exactly what we are interested in now, because we are going to tell about the gender constructions in this poem. Monta Krona, in her poems of the 60s and 70s, were challenging gender normativity by freely expressing sensibility and sensuality, including woman's desire for man's body. Your brown eyes are almost black is a poem from her collection of poems Tuvplānā, And after this collection was published, critics were not receiving it very well. And for example, this poem seemed to be then too obscure or too funny. As you can imagine, that boys in swimming trunks as a repetitive image were considered to be by some critics as something funny, something that shouldn't be presented in a serious poem. And that treatment of male body recalls some other poems by modernist poets from different countries. There were several modernist writers writing about working class men's bodies, for example, American Walt Whitman and Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet, Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca, Greek poet Yanis Ritsos, and also Latvian poet Aleksandrs Čaks. As well, Russian poet Andrei Votnisensky, Kramov's contemporary, whose poems she admired a lot. In poems by those writers, naked bodies of working class men get associated with oil, gas, asphalt, tar, and other substances that contribute to modern technologies. In the case of Whitman and Lorca, it seems reasonable to speak about erotization of male bodies. For example, in Whitman's Song of Myself and Lorca's Ode to Walt Whitman. And I'll try to share another slide now. I'm sorry, I seem to be somehow lost in this process. Okay, I get it. I hope you see it as well. So you see two poems by Walt Whitman and English translation of Lorca's poem Ode to Walt Whitman, a few lines of each poem. For example, Whitman writes, "Blacksmith with grimed and hairy chests environ the anvil. Each has his main sledge. They are all out. There is great heat in the fire. From the cinder-strewed threshold, I follow their movements. The lithe sheer of their waists plays even with their massive arms. Overhand the hammers swing, overhand so slow, overhand so sure. They do not hasten. Each man fits in his place." And Lorca. By the East River and the Bronx, boys were singing, exposing their waists, with the wheel, with oil, with rawhide and hammer. 90,000 miners taking silver from the rocks, and children drawing stairs and perspectives. So Whitman, in Whitman's Song of Myself, where his eyes slide over the bodies of half-naked blacksmiths, and Lorca's Ode to Walt Whitman, where half-naked boys are seen on the background of river and urban landscape. In those both cases, it seems reasonable to speak about eroticization of male bodies. And both poets who are speaking about working class male bodies, both in eroticizing way and probably not, but they are still contributing to this tradition of depicting the modern masculinity in poetry. And Kroma's innovation is in claiming her place in international modernism by adopting elements of male gaze, including queer male gaze, and writing about men's bodies in the same way as male poets did. Such presence of physicality and eroticism, especially talking about male body from female perspective, is very uncharacteristic to Latvian poetry of Soviet times, also before Soviet times. So you can speak about Kroma as a great innovator in gender politics in Soviet Latvian poetry. And I'm going to address two more poems which deals with gender in a different way. The first of them is the first part of the poem Diopters by Vācietis, published in 1971 in his collection Melnās ogas, Black Berries. And this poem goes like this. Did you know that Maple is not she Maple at all, but he Maple? There is nothing feminine about him. He's like Oak's brother, with muscles strong and dry. And how can they give the male gender to Birch Tree, the mysterious Mona Lisa of North? Don't you see the naked beauty of woman's body? And what about Kaiser's crown? Only an insane Kaiser can put a lily on his head. Oh, how we love to cheat ourselves and others with our myopia. I entered the birch grove yesterday at dusk, and I realized I had entered woman's bathhouse. As you can see, some of these words are colored in red and blue. The red ones are those which are typically female gender in Latvian. For example, Maple, Kļava is always regarded as female and representing some female qualities. The same can be told about lily, the flower. And what Vācietis does here is taking certain trees or flowers and trying to prove that their grammatical gender is wrong, and actually they should be addressed like in an opposite way. Those feminine things are actually masculine and vice versa. And this poem can be seen as a part of a bit larger agenda in Vācietis poetry of the 1970s. First of all, he was changing gender for trees and plants which have stable associations with gender in Latvian folklore and literature. For example, oak trees and linden trees serve as symbols of gender difference, where oaks stand for masculinity, while lindens are marked as feminine. In this system, if we try to change some gender of some very well-known and symbolically important tree, then we achieve very strange effect that we are thrown out of our usual understanding of gender difference and how it functions in Latvian poetry and folklore. And this wider agenda femininity and masculinity I just mentioned, unlike many representations of masculinity in Western culture, which place it above femininity, Latvia's agenda includes adoration and support of the feminine element, placing it higher than qualities traditionally attributed to masculinity. So Baltijas tries to prove that masculinity shouldn't be valorized as much as it probably was or is in his poems of the 70s. You can find several moments when masculinity is regarded as inferior to femininity. And another example similar to Baltijas' poem is another one poem written by Latvian poet Grīnvalde, published in 1981, and this poem in English could be called The Little Snag or The Little Root. Its title is actually untranslatable in Latvian. It is Čakārnītis. Up to the neck in a brown swamp squats a little snag, crooked and twisted. A birch tree is standing on a mountain in the blue sky to its roots. Oh snag, are you out of your mind to look at the birch? You're so crooked, twisted and muddy, who would ever love you? But the snag writes letters to the birch. He keeps writing them and tearing up, and all the birch-cherry trees become white when the morning wind blows. Fragrance of the birch-cherry trees rises against the mountain, telling about its happiness, like the white, bitter rejoicing that comes from the breast of the snag. He is in the swamp, so what? And he is crooked and twisted, so what? The sky is bright blue. The birch tree is so beautiful. And Belševica was famous for her active work with Latvian language, both as a poet and translator, as well for her attempts to enlarge the vocabulary of Latvian poetry by looking upwards, looking for old forgotten words in dictionaries or inspiring from folklore. Belševica's Čakārnītis can be read as her answer to Latvia's changing of grammatical gender to different trees and flowers. If Čakārnītis and Bērs, the birch tree, both are male, then this is a poem about gay love. If they are allegoric projections of particular state of mind without stable gender identification, then it can be said that Belševica has gone much more further than Latvia's and has created a love story where gender difference does not matter. In addition to queerness, the word Čakārnītis and that poem can become a symbol of disability because of them being crooked and twisted. In 2017, Latvian activist of scoliosis patients Ilga Zundāne published an article where she identified as Čakārnītis because the twisted spine of scoliosis patients reminded her of Belševica's poem, The Twisted Little Root. And these three poems invite us to revisit concepts of gender in Latvian Soviet poetry. Krama's poem is an interesting example of the construction of woman's gaze, where different categories of masculinity, femininity, and queerness coexist in her modernist poetics. Latviets and Belševica uses Latvian language as a tool to dismantle the traditional gender difference Latvians by swapping the grammatical gender from masculine to feminine or vice versa. Belshevitz, by creating her story of unreturned love of somebody who can easily be read as queer and disabled, whose identification with a particular gender is not that much important. So, pretty much uncommon feature in Latvian poetry of Soviet time. And I would add that the biggest challenge while working on that paper was to do my rough translations in English, because translating these poems, especially Belševič's poem, it felt like words are having their meaning and system and beauty only in the original language, while English translation seems to be very clumsy and not really reflecting what that poem actually is about. Probably it's about the beauty of Latvian language as Belševič saw it, and every translation, including my rough translations, they will always be incomplete. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a wonderful conference.
Thank you, Carly. Yeah, so transatlantic thanks to Carly's, and well, thank you very much all for being such an attentive audience. The session is over.